fascism in Europe, and so they developed critical theory, which now is in all the headlines. It's one branch of it, critical race theory, but critical theory, is that because he relies so much on history and he's on both sides of the fence? And I don't want to say he's a critic. He's he reveals. So can it be thought of as a critical theory approach?
Oh boy, that is a fabulous nest of questions there. I think the place to start is with Nietzsche. You know, we begin with Nietzsche. He says, you know, philosophy is only for the healthy. The sick, it's only ever made sicker. There's nothing that you can come up with in philosophy that can't be misused. When we look at, for example, the things that the Nazis did with black letter, the things that they did with branding and PR, the things that they did with their critiques of society and so forth, all of this stuff, you know, on the one hand, it's all tarnished with the miasma of association with them. But on the other hand, none of it belonged to them anyway. Like the swastika has been around for thousands of years and it never meant Nazis. It only ever meant other things. It's used in Native American philosophy and symbology. It's used in India. It's used in Japan. But now they've tarnished it. They've got their ick on it. And they got, what's really happened here is not that they have damaged black letter or the swastika or any of the other things that they've embraced, but rather that they got their ick on us. We've grown up with the idea that they're right, that those things belong to them, and that they can only be used to support them. And in doing that, we're basically letting the Nazis dictate terms to us about how we're going to interact with the world and interact with the history of ideas. It's pernicious, and it's really quite difficult to fully come to grips with, because, you know, our visceral reaction is understandably so strong. We want nothing to do with them. But the problem is they've, you know, draped themselves over things that didn't belong to them and claimed them. So we have that same problem when it comes to evaluating history or criticizing culture or society. Just because they did it and they were nasty and icky doesn't mean that now nobody gets to do it. It does right up until the point when we defy the Nazis and say, no, we're not going to let you claim these things. These things are older than you are. They're useful. They're important, and we're going to apply them in ways that, frankly, would, you know, we're going to apply them in ways that would horrify the Nazis. They would not like the ways that we're going to apply culture criticism and the use of the history, of the philosophy of history. So on the one hand, there are immense parallels. You're absolutely right. There's no getting away from the way that these things have been associated with these movements. But that's okay. We don't actually want to get away from that. We want to confront it and talk about it directly. And that's the way that we deal with this.
Did you ever see the film Flash Gordon, the 1980 version?
Oh, yes. With the soundtrack.
The great sequence where Alexei Zarkov is having his mind replaced by the cohorts of Ming.
Yes.
They're draining his memory and going back through his past and, you know, seeing Earth's history, and they see Hitler standing up amongst the figures of history. And as far as these aliens were concerned, they finally found a human being that showed promise.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that's a good example. You know, I think about the work that Walter Kaufmann did in the mid-20th century rescuing Nietzsche from the Nazis, where he said, yes, they draped themselves all over Nietzsche, but Nietzsche hated anti-Semitism. He despised it. And he hated German nationalism. He despised it. He wrote withering criticisms of both of those things. And what was required for the Nazis to drape themselves all over Nietzsche and make him their poster boy was massive distortion, which is not surprising considering that that's what they did in every other facet of their movement. So I think there's a certain understandable desire to flee from the things that we perceive as having been contaminated. But I think we really empower ourselves when instead we confront the contamination and we say, no, this is not yours. We're going to reclaim this. And so, criticizing culture, criticizing modernism, it doesn't have to be done in order to, achieve a fascist utopian ideal. It can be done in an existentialist way, to just say, who are we really, in the context of history? Who have we become? And what does that say about the people who came before us and the people who could come after us? And we can do the same thing with all of these things. We have to, really, because otherwise we're surrendering, despite the fact that we won the war, which,
I've always, thank you, and I'll real quick follow up. I've always held that the Frankfurt School, their mission was one of praxis, that they wanted to dissect or study history looking forward so that we could figure out how we got here when it's an undesirable situation. How did we get here in a pragmatic, practical way so that going forward, we won't make the same mistakes? Do you see Kenneth as kind of, when he does the millennia and he whatever, is he suggesting us moderns, this is kind of how we got thinking this way, and he wants us to think differently? I don't know.
Yeah, certainly before, like I mentioned, on Saturday or Friday night, for those of us on the other half of the planet, he started out he wanted to be a sociologist. He grew up with Max Weber and C. Wright Mills. Frankfurt School includes Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno. All these are people who Kenneth Smith was reading long before he got into philosophy. And so he brings that perspective into philosophy. He wants to, critique the way that we think in context, in terms of the history of how we got here, so that we stop seeing ourselves abstractly. So we stop seeing ourselves as, the best, the brightest, the newest, even the name, the modernist, right? It contains all sorts of kind of subliminal programming about how we're supposed to cheer and jump up and down. And he's like, no, this is a perspective that we share as moderns. And we can't understand that perspective until we know, first of all, that it is a perspective and that it's not God's own truth. We're not seeing with the scientific eyes of clarity. We're seeing with a very specific historical perspective. And then by putting that in the context of how other people saw, and this is where Millennia and Microcosm, this book, is really useful. He's going to not only introduce the idea, but he's going to do a deep dive on the medieval perspective on the world and God and nature and man. And he's going to do the same thing with the ancient view. And by doing those at a deep dive, getting us out of the modernist perspective on what we imagine their perspective to be, by instead getting us into their perspective so that we can see with their lenses, we can then turn around and look back at ourselves and see ourselves finally breaking free of that trap that Hegel warned us about, where the familiar is not recognized for what it is, because it's familiar.
Okay, Kenneth Smith is clearly a traditionalist and a reactionary.
Yes, he's several things at the same time, right? You could say both of those things, but you could also say he's a progressive. Because in the modern era, we think that progressive and reactionary are opposites and they must be two opposing political camps. But one of the core arguments of Hegel and other existentialists is that all of these categories that we attempt to sort people into, they're Procrustean beds. They're all very distorting. They don't let us see things as they actually are. And so something, a core problem is that our lives and our perspectives and our minds as mortals are finite, but we live in an infinite cosmos full of infinite principles. And when we attempt to represent that infinitude inside of a finite frame, it is impossible not to do violence to what we're trying to talk about. And that's what happens when we call somebody a progressive, when we call somebody a reactionary, we call them a traditionalist, we call them an anti-traditionalist. In every case, we're hammering them into fitting into a frame, and they don't entirely, right? These movements are bigger than these labels. So there is this feature of the human condition that Heraclitus sort of embraced and made a central tenet of his philosophy. And of course, Heraclitus was central to Hegel, and Heraclitus is central to Kenneth Smith, which is that if your attempts to represent the deep things of the world don't ultimately stand on paradoxical foundations, you definitely aren't doing justice to it. Because any attempt to fit the infinite inside of the finite always results in paradox. So yes, reactionary, and yes, progressive at the same time. Just not in the way that either of those political movements would particularly like. They'd like some parts and dislike others. I see we got hands, so let's go ahead and hit that. Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I've always thought that Nazis had good graphics. I mean, just superb graphics, right?
Yeah.
And yesterday I attended a meeting of Hegel, who says something very important about this.
Yes.
And the difference was between a symbol and a sign. And the symbol actually captures the deep meaning within the structure of the symbol that represents the original insight that has kind of maintained and grew up and diversified and whatever. And the sign has taken advantage of the symbol in terms of its emotional intelligence and represented as pure graphics by boosting up the amplitude of the graphics and downplaying its connection to the symbol.
Right.
And so I think, once again, Hegel seemed to like anticipate it and know something about something that was very important. And so they were able to manage a population that was, on the one hand, easily hypnotized by the sign that presumes to capture the meaning of the symbol, but in fact it doesn't.
Right.
Because it could just be pinned on some irrelevant object, and suddenly it has supposedly the power of the symbol. And I think that's exactly how they did it. They brought significant symbols from various cultures, and they were quite adamant in just, and subverting those into signs that they could use to, in a sense, validate the underlying meaning of of their system. I thought that was very enlightening. And I think that in a lot of modern life, we had took advantage of symbols and turned it into just terrific graphics.
Right.
The market stuff, you know what I mean? Because the sign actually signifies in a surface way the meaning that behind it. So therefore, you have a picture of Mount Shasta and terrific typography that goes along with it. It's like it seems to mean something, and in fact, the water came from somewhere else. It's all, and I think that was a good piece of information for me to be aware of empty signs that pretends to represent something very deep and very important. Yes. And I think that's something that modern culture has looked to understand that that's what's selling you. And I think once you understand that, you begin to understand the morass we're in modern civilization.
Yes. Yeah, that's really potent what you've said there. There have been some fascinating studies. I wish I could remember the names off the top of my head that go into the psychology of fascism. And they explore the preoccupation with signs and uniforms and symbols, where, like you're saying, they want the signs to be as powerful as they can be. They're going for just an amazing, potent impact. It's why, for example, brutalist architecture was so big in Nazi Germany, because these large buildings with defined shapes that are bigger than we are and don't seem to even have a place for a human being to exist in them. They're like a punch in the face in terms of architectural design. just like those uniforms, just like those badges and insignias. The goal was to get this incredibly shiny, powerful, emotionally evocative exterior. And when you put that side by side with Hannah Arendt's observations about Eichmann, that you go into a trial with Eichmann in Jerusalem expecting to find just this incredibly passionate, driven man, maybe a monster of emotion and intellect. And instead, she found the most boring, ordinary functionary she could imagine. He had nothing but cliches inside of him. And they weren't passionate cliches, even. They were just, he was just doing his job. He just wanted to, please his superiors. And he pretty much saw it the way all of us see a normal 9-to-5 job. He literally had no convictions at all. All of his power of personality was on the outside, in the uniform and the symbols, the signs, right? They invested so much on the external impression of strength that they ended up becoming hollow dolls who had really nothing inside except for sort of the barest framework that they took from others. Like relentlessly reciting passages from Nietzsche out of context in order to make him seem to say the opposite of what he's saying, so that he would seem, they were finding somebody who hated anti-Semitism to prop up anti-Semitism. They were finding someone who hated German nationalism to prop up German nationalism, because that was the best they could do to find an authentic prop. They had no inner conviction or logic other than what they were trying to pull off. This kind of sense of external power but internal emptiness, this is the thing we don't want to talk about the Nazis, because it looks too much like us. When we look at our mechanized life that has, we have the biggest military of all time, somebody walked on the moon, we have all these obvious signs of power, and yet we can't even get people into houses, and we can't even educate people without putting them into lifelong debt. And people are dying of preventable diseases because we can't get our healthcare together. There's like all over society, you find evidence that the inner culture and the inner personality is empty and evacuated. Everything's been put into the external and the mechanisms, just like the fascists did. And that's a comparison that doesn't make us comfortable, which is why in the movies, whenever they do Nazis, they're always screaming and frothing at the mouth and full of the passion that they don't actually have internally. So thank you for bringing that up, Phil. Donald, and then Sharon and Peter. Go ahead, Donald.
Yes.
Now, I would first like to reiterate that it's very, I think it's almost wasted effort to try and get a political agenda out of Kenneth's philosophy.
Yes.
Almost, I won't even qualify it with almost. All contemporary political movements are just some symptom of the modernism that ails us. It's not, I'm not saying that choosing among them might not make some difference at some margin.
Right.
But they all are infected by this same disease.
Yes.
So don't go looking for him to say, he can be critical. I mean, he's from Texas. He doesn't like the Bushes. There are a lot of things like that. But ask him about other political parties, because the criticisms he makes are more or less fitting for everyone. So yeah. I think that's that somewhat separates him from these critical theory people, which derive a political agenda. He's more interested in personal enlightenment or how we got there. And when the Nazis gave up on Nietzsche somewhat and picked up Heidegger,
yes,
my view is, how could anyone tell? I had a professor that really liked Heidegger, and I read all kinds of Heidegger for about 3 years. and how you could tell whether what you thought was supported or not supported by anything or everything that Heidegger ever said, I don't know. I mean, that Heidegger makes Kenneth look like reading C Spot Run, you know. You know, just
yeah. Kenneth is a lot more clear.
Huh?
Kenneth is a lot clearer than
He's
Heidegger.
a lot clearer than Martin Heidegger.
Yes.
You know, and
which is really saying something.
You know, but I mean, in some ways, Heidegger does the same kinds of things that Kenneth does. He's very historical. He's very existential. He tries to derive greater structure, understanding of structure, but that's neither here nor there. I've heard Kenneth seldom mention Heidegger or even reference Heidegger. So I don't think he feels Heidegger adds anything to what he's saying.
I think he finds him obscure.
And two, kind of back to the first point, progressive. That is certainly the false myth of modernity. Just progress. What we think of as, you know, or I don't know, when Obama says, you know, history curves towards I don't see any direction in history. Not that looking back, one cannot assemble something to make it clear. Where it goes is not determined. There aren't any actors besides us.
Right.
There are no human actors in Kenneth's stuff. He is existential. There's not the, I mean, as many times as he's mocked Adam Smith's invisible hand, I can't imagine that he believes that there's another beneficent invisible hand guiding history in its inevitable progress, especially because he probably would say history is not progressing, it's regressing. That modernity is a step below, or you know, well, anyway.
Or on the level.
On the level. Well, yeah, I'm, you know, would I have rather been a peasant in the Middle Ages or a slave in the ancient world? Because I wouldn't have been a high church official, a member of the feudal royal families, or a member of the famous, the 600 property families of Athens, or whatever Davies wrote a famous book about. Okay.
I can offer you a viewpoint on that one. Go for the medieval peasant. Being a slave in ancient Rome was crap.
Oh, I don't want to be in Rome. I would
Nobody
rather
wants
be
to be in Rome.
Oh, yeah, I'm talking about the Roman Empire. Anybody on the lower level in the Roman Empire.
Oh, I'd be in the silver mines.
The medieval peasant had a small amount of hope. But if you were a slave in the Roman Empire, hope was very, very narrow.
It was.
Well, I thought in Athens, if you were a really good slave and showed you could rule yourself, that they might release you from your servitude. At least Aristotle indicates that such could happen. That some people were not enslaved. Anyway.
But Sparta, on the other hand,
nobody
wants to be a slave in Sparta either.
Well, you're not only there, depending on your status, you get to fight as auxiliaries in their army. Which means you're in the spear and arrow catching department or something.
Right, cannon fodder. Anyway, yes. Yeah, you know, in summary, it's true. He would say moderns typically get very infatuated with their political parties And in doing so, they forget that their political parties are all moderns and that they all suffer from the same disease of modernism. And that causes them to have enormous blind spots, so that there's a reason why their promises are so good, but the delivery after the election is so bad, at least after the first 100 days. There's an enormous amount of corruption just built into the system. And if any political party, at least in the United States, that doesn't wholeheartedly embrace that corruption, even if they don't make that their brands, they can't get elected. You have to really cozy up to the banks and the petroleum companies and the billionaires, and you got to take their money. And it's a very rare politician who doesn't do that, and generally they don't get elected. That's because of the structures of modernism, because of the way that it works. But we sort of can't tolerate that situation. It's too existentially horrific for us to fully admit how messed up our political system is. And so it's very easy to seduce us into projecting all of our hopes into whichever side we have reluctantly chosen as our party. So yeah, Kenneth Smith will savage the Republicans, especially the Bushes, who he knew very well because of their proximity. But then he'll turn around and savage the Democrats too. And so nobody can decide which team he's on. And that's because he's not on the team of modernism. And these are both preeminent examples of modernism.
Yeah,
he would certainly not say a pox on both houses. He would not say it doesn't matter who you vote for. He would say it matters at a tactical level, but it doesn't matter at a strategic level. Neither of these parties is going to address anything deep and fundamental. So you end up having to pick between which issue of the day or tactical thing you need to overcome.
Yeah, and I also wanted to thank Marx for helping bring modernity to the Asian continent there. And
that's a whole other discussion.
Yes.
We'll come to that.
You know, that I know that's kind of a perverse thing, because we look to Marx for so many critiques of modernity and of the capitalism. And yet he's been a tremendous instrument for spreading modernity to people who would have, I don't know what they would have done. They would have remained Confucian or Buddhist or Hindu or whatever. But
Yeah.
they can go right to the mid 19th century.
Hooray. All right. Well, Sharon, then Peter, then MJ, then Marianne. Yay. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I have a couple of comments, and then I have a question. So I want to go back to what Phil said about sign and symbol. And my question is, isn't that the operational philosophy of almost all political movements, the communists, the Nazis, and even our own MAGA hats? Everybody has a symbol, which is a loud symbol, but a very empty core. And I think that has transcended time. It's just the way they operate. Am I correct about that? And the second thing is, when you come to choosing a historical period in which you would be optimized, I choose the one I'm in now, because hope is a process that's constant, that's changing. It's complex, it's changing. So wherever you are at that point in time, I think you have to honor it. And the last thing I want to say is this essay for Kenneth Smith, Time, History, and Nature,
Yes.
which we were assigned to read. I really enjoyed it. And I like the way he divided the essay into three parts: ancient, medievals, and moderns. And the part that I found most perspective and consciousness raising was the ancient part of it. And there was one word which I picked up, which I thought transcended that whole 5 or 6 paragraph, and it was the word physiocratic, which was an economic theory.
Yes.
Which I didn't know what it was, so I had to read about it. But I thought if that is when it started, we are still practicing some of those economic paradigms today. So I thought he did a very good job of explaining and giving a perspective of the ancient world and comparing it to where we are today, just by that one word, physiocratic.
That's right. Yeah, once again, you go right to the nugget, Sharon. So thank you for that. Physiocratic would be the if you had to sum up the ancient worldview in one word, that would be it. Because man, God, and nature, they put the other way around. They put nature on top. Nature is the ruler, right? Kratein, the ruling, physio from physis, meaning growing, or becoming, meaning the domain of nature. So, nature was the primary source of all meaning and authority, and the gods derived their authority and meaning from nature. They expressed elements of nature, but they didn't stand above it, and nature preceded them. There's a quote from Heraclitus that I reread on Friday in preparation for that presentation that said, the universe always is and always has been. It was created by no man or God. And in that, it is the clearest possible statement of the physiocratic perspective, that nature came first and the gods come second, and man, as he later describes, comes third. So this essay was the one that made me call Kenneth Smith. When I very first reached out to him, it was this chapter. When this installment came out, I loved the clarity of it. I thought it was much better, much easier for me to see what he was trying to say than in any of the previous things he'd written for Dramas of the Mind in his previous
clear perspective. I thought he gave a very clear perspective in dividing the time periods and highlighting the important, influential events during those time periods.
Yes.
Excuse me for interrupting.
No, but you're right. That's exactly right. So what's going to happen in this book is, first he had the preface where he sort of explains why he's generally doing this sort of thing. Then there's this chapter. This introduction is sort of a capsule of the rest of the book. He's then going to have two chapters where, being Kenneth, he has to take a side tangent and talk about the issue in general again. But after that, the entire rest of the book is built around, first talking about one epoch, then talking about the second epoch, and then talking about the third epoch. And in each one, he's breaking down the core ideas and principles that informed the worldviews of those epoch to try to help us learn how to see the world through their eyes. Yes. So this really introduces what he's going to do in the rest of the book. It's one of my favorite things that he's written. So, but before that, you said two other things, and now I've lost them because of the third thing.
Oh, I was talking about, I referred to Phil's definition of sign and symbol. And I was asking, even just that, isn't that the basic modus operandi of most political movements? They have a very loud narrative and an empty core and an empty inner core. And I thought the MAGA movement that we're experiencing still is pretty much like that. Mm-hmm. The Nazis did it, the communists did it. It's a political tool to sway the masses. Yes. That's the essence of it.
Yes, and it's modernist at its core. It's part of the reason why we see it over and over in political movements, is that all the political movements we know anything about are modernist. We have no direct experience of what a medieval political movement would even be like, or what an ancient political movement would be like. When you talked about, which epoch would you want to live in, you said you'd want to live in this one. Part of the reason why that's important is that when we do these questions about when would you want to live in history, there is a sense in which we are setting aside Gnosis and embracing Noesis, because we're talking about ourselves as though we are a liberated, free abstraction who could be equally competent at any period in history. But the truth is, you have to learn so much about the epoch you live in order to be competent in it, that we would be incompetent peasants. We would be incompetent slaves. In the ancient world and in the medieval world, we would not know what the hell we were doing. And especially as moderns, we would go into it thinking that, of course, we know more than they do because we're modern and they're primitive. But what we would discover is that there's an enormous amount of knowledge and culture that goes into succeeding in those epochs, and we have none of it. We don't know anything about how you thrive or what your possibilities for freedom are, or how to live a good life for any period except this one. It may be a struggle now. We may be in a terrible labyrinth fighting inside a great machine trying to figure out how to be human beings, but at least we know what it is, more or less. We can have these conversations about it, and we have a common frame of reference. If we sat down we sat down with someone in ancient Rome, we would be shocked by how little common frame of reference we have. The things that they would laugh at and take for granted, that all of their other Roman friends would all chuckle about, and we'd be sitting there getting maybe one thing in 20. And then, but sadly, we would think that we were getting a lot of it when we were getting very little of it. It would be this massive state of misunderstanding and delusion would be happening. So I'm with you. This is our epoch, right? This is what we're made for.
So the hope of each epoch is extremely contextual.
Yes.
And that's it.
Yeah, that's the idea. And this comes from Heraclitus, from Hegel, from Kierkegaard, from Nietzsche, from Arendt, from Smith. This idea that even though modernism tells us that we have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the truth is those are abstractions. We are not abstractions. We are lawful organisms caught within a much larger lawful organism. And we can only be the things that are within reach for us to be. We can't just like transmute ourselves into infinite possibilities, no matter how much we talk about that in our politics. Like our political campaigns and slogans are always full of all the hope and all the things that you can just do because you want to, because that's the modernist orthodoxy. Your desire creates reality. But the truth is, it's the lawful structure of our character and the lawful structure of our culture and the world around it that give us our possibilities. And if we don't know what those things are and how they work, then we're going to be ineffective when we try to act in the world, because we won't be taking into account the way things actually are. Peter, then MJ, then Marianne, then Phil, then Stephen. Go ahead, Peter.
I am going to fail dramatically at expressing my thoughts, but I'll give it a shot anyway, because my thoughts are very complex about the reading. Although I do want to, I guess, at first reiterate I suppose pretty much his idea is that it is because we do not understand these grand shifts in narrative and these stages of development that in modernity, that is what causes our confusion and ignorance, because we have not been in touch with are able to distinguish these different types of inherited mindsets, and therein lies what he views as the issue.
Right.
Now, to that specifically, I want to characterize that in a way that I think that is incredibly predictable. I think that there's this idea, I think, for ivory tower scholars, this whole idea of only everyone studied what I studied. If only everyone spent the 40 years necessary digging at all these things, then they would get it. And I think that therein lies that type of that disassociation, that lack of connection with the ground of, about the types of ideas and range of view, however much you may try to distill it, is that sort of, there's always a fundamental shooting yourself in the foot by superimposing a simple narrative to make it easier for the average person in regards to a story that can be grasped as such. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the, one thing, in my opinion, what's sort of revealing a bit of this story that he's telling, I mean, simplistic or aside, I don't judge it for that, but I think it's sort of in that sort of third wave of modernity. He's bringing up, people like Pico della Mirandola, mm-hmm. And I find it very curious, especially with my previous impressions about him, of how he's getting this the brother of Christian Kabbalah. He died very young. Had a lot of this leading in towards modernist existential solipsism, right? Something that's not in touch with the physical, not in touch with any kind of collective metaphysical, mm-hmm. but merely entertaining one's individualistic fantasies.
Right.
And to me, it's in that narrative, I think that he doesn't really, if this is his world Western narrative in regards to the problem, the solution. If this is only a little piece of it. Well, sure, but this is how he's characterizing it. And through the book, he's going to then support it in different ways. This narrative, right?
Well, he'll do that, but he'll also, the more important thing he's going to do in the rest of the book is show how this narrative, which is only one perspective, intersects mm-hmm. with some of the other perspectives you have to put the whole picture together. He's just using this as a thread in order to connect to a lot of other takes.
Fair enough. I would just say that, one thing that I find, in my opinion, grossly missing in this third I have no primary issue with the first two stages. It's the third that I find very curious. There's something within the New Age community called unverified personal gnosis. It is the range of which one's individual experience might, for that person, supersede theological truth.
Yes.
And so he's saying that is the fundamental issue as being the third modernist self-obsession. And I would argue that although there's truth to that, from my view of history, it's been this hyper-rationality in contrast that has led us further away from unverified personal gnosis. So I think he's completely off the mark there in regards to that type of characterization of the issue of modernity.
He actually agrees with what you just said your position was.
That he didn't write it in there.
No, he'll get to that as he unpacks it. But the idea is that in modernity, our gnosis has been truncated and turned into a finitized, infantilized form of gnosis. And it's been done that's happened in submission to a culture of noesis. And the culture of noesis, again, is an infantilized, finitized form. But the purpose is to turn it all around so that the full possibilities of gnosis can't be experienced. They're cut off. And instead, we replace that with sort of what he would call a mass-produced, pre-formatted generic personalities. He says, the thing about modernism that's different from any period before in history is the amazing power we have to pre-format personalities and mass-produce them. So that...
But he wasn't arguing that, at least there. He was arguing that the issue was people entertaining all of these personalized, attractive fantasies and divorcing themselves from potential physical or metaphysical truth.
Yeah, he's going to get there. It's one of his central points in this book, but he has to work his way up to it. So, I think you'll be pleased by some of what's to come because it's going to agree with what you're saying.
May I just jump in here for 1 minute?
Yeah,
Rick, because I enjoyed this whole essay, except for this last paragraph, moderns. And I have the same question that Peter has. So he chooses that philosopher, Pico della Mirandola, who came from 1486. And I got lost in that whole paragraph as he used this man's teachings in philosophy to try to explain moderns. I thought he belonged back in the medieval times. And that was one of the questions that I came away from. So I hear you, Peter.
No, yeah. See, what's happening is that Pico is right at the inflection point. He's right at the boundary from medievalism to modernism. He is, Martin Luther is, there's a number of people who you can sort of pull out as key moments in the process of not just losing faith in the medieval promise, but of coming up with an alternative, right? So the theses nailed to the church door by Martin Luther was not the point at which people began to be frustrated with the corruption of medievalism. It was a point at which they had a clear, cogent counter response to say, instead of medievalism, what about this? Right? Here's why it can't be medievalism. So by the time you get to Martin Luther, you're well into modernism. They're really putting their framework together. Pico della Mirandola is one of the earliest statements of some of the premises of modernism, but it's not just like there's a single moment. It's, remember, the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. There's this whole process of unfolding that has to happen to leave behind the medieval era and to move into the modernist era. And he likes Pico because Pico comes so early, and yet his statements are so modern. Other people at the exact same time as Pico were still completely inside of the medieval worldview. There were some people who were struggling with it, and there were other people who were still inside of it. It was a very early stage in the process. So he would say, I think, in agreement with Hegel, and perhaps in disagreement with the way that Marx has been interpreted by Marxists, he'd say there isn't a moment in history which is a line between one age and another. because that's not how organisms grow. It's not like you're a 10-year-old child and then the next day you're an adult. There is this long unfolding process. So that's why Pico's there. That's why it's as early as it is. But he's definitely not saying that from there on it was all modern. He's saying that was the first time modernism pretty much stood up and said what was on its mind, if that makes sense. So yeah, this is I think it's going to take a couple of weeks to go through this first essay, but we'll definitely dig into this. Each of these people he's citing as examples, we'll pull some of their work out and we'll talk about it, and we'll see if we agree with where he's going with it. But in this first introduction, most of what he's going to say, most of the meat of the argument isn't here. This is introducing the framework so that he can get the meat going. So Peter, for example, what we're going to see is that in the question about, is modernism defined by the Griff and sort of, the finitized Gnosis, or is it defined by Verstand and the finitized Noesis? The answer is going to be paradoxical. He's going to say, yes, it's defined by both of those things working together as an engine, as a system that reinforces itself. And that the form of Gnosis that you see in Begriff is not the mature adult form. And the form of Noesis that you see in Verstand is not the mature adult form. And it's these two infantilized forms working together that define the framework of reality. And so he doesn't fit well into the camp of I'm pro-left brain or I'm pro-right brain, because what he's arguing along with Hegel is that for the mature adult psychology required to create genuine culture, you need Vernunft, which brings both of them together, Gnosis and Noesis. And they can't come together as long as they remain in their infantilized forms that modernism mass produces. He also talks about another thing that's going to be a major theme is that because of this mass production, people have a false consciousness where they think that their private, most individualized part of themselves, their interior, their mind, they think this is where I'm most myself. And that's a Noetic idea, first of all, that what you're thinking is the real you and not what you're doing in the world and how you relate to people. But the paradox is the very people thinking that they're most free and most themselves inside their mind, by the time they can think that, they've already been mass produced. That's where they're the most generic and the least free. The things that they're thinking with, the things that they're thinking about have all been provided for them by these industries of mass production of human beings. And as a result, people can be as gnosic as they want in that context. But the problem is that the form of their gnosis, because it's infantilized and mass produced, is actually a product of noesis. When they're being their most subjective, they're acting as a symptom of something that was created in a very rationalized, intellectualized way, even though that's not how they experience it in their own life. So there are paradoxes in this. He's gonna explore all of this, the tissues of it, and show us kind of how modernism is structured. And you can critique it as we go. I'm all in favor of that. But he really doesn't get into the full meat of that in this introduction. MJ, then Marianne, then Phil, then Stephen. Go ahead, MJ.
Hi. Okay, this is a really tiny point, and it may be off base, but going back to the Nazis' fascination with using Nietzsche, I make a distinction between the Nietzsche material that was corrupted by his sister Elizabeth and how she Nazified it. And I kind of subscribe to a lot of the theory that had she not, that it wouldn't have been so attractive, and it would be a lot more palatable and intelligible. So I wanted to offer that just as someone who, if you mention Nietzsche, they're looking for your Nazi symbols.
Yes.
Okay, so that was just in the honesty of dealing with it. People would make that really clear. And the other thing I wanted to mention is kind of building on Kenneth's writing is, I don't know if this is like postmodernism, but I feel that context no
Yes.
longer exists. It isn't necessary for people to feel that they have the idea. My example is, yes, Wikipedia gave you the facts, but you can't put it with another Wikipedia article and come up with the context for the two. So I'm seeing a failure of, okay, last word. Wittgenstein said, all we have in the world are ideas. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope it wasn't
MJ.
off base.
No, that was good. So yeah, Kaufman really did the world a service by scraping off the mess that Nietzsche's sister and her anti-Semitic nationalist boyfriend did to Nietzsche, and restoring him to the way that he was meant to be read, because it is an eye-opener when you've been raised thinking that Nietzsche is somehow closely associated with the Nazis, and then you're reading these passages where nobody could mistake his withering criticism of anti-Semitism for praise. I mean, he despises it. And he praises the Jews. He praises Jewish culture and the ways that the Jews wrestle with their theology, and contrasts it with sort of the overly naive way that most Christian churches sort of look for ways to embrace what they perceive to be their theology. And he says, these are two completely different cultures. One of them is saying, I want to submit to what I'm taught. And the other one is saying, not only do I want to wrestle with what I've just taught, I will even wrestle with an angel or wrestle with God. All of it, all the way up, needs to be struggled with. And it's high praise. There's no way to read that as somebody who would be in favor of the Holocaust, right? And in case there's any doubt, when he starts talking about German nationalism, he's not only deeply critical, he's, how can I say it, memorably insulting. He has some of the best insults that anybody has ever made up for German nationalism. When he talks about how much beer and drunken revelry and bloated, he portrays this picture of Oktoberfest with people slurring their words and not knowing quite what they're saying, and saying that is German patriotism, that is German nationalism. Who would aspire to, sloshing your beer around, we're the best, as any kind of, thing for people to arise to. And once you've read that, it's just impossible ever again to see Nietzsche as pro-Nazi, which is why they cut all that stuff out. We're gonna make all of our little Nazi friends read Nietzsche, but only after we strip out every last thing he had to say about us, because it actually doesn't sound very good. So yeah, I'm with you. Marianne, then Phil, then Stephen. Go ahead, Marianne.
It's good to be with you guys again.
Likewise.
I had thoughts about when you were talking about external power and inner power.
Yes.
And I thought in my personal history about Kent State, how really it was shown that the police were stronger than the people that were protesting, and how it influenced people to go into their inner thing, like that movements of Est and Big Sur. People were kind of lost, and then they tried to find that inner power. But I think what happened was that the consumerism co-opted that sense of trying to find the individual power, and they just became fodder for corporations. And I think that what I liked about Kenneth Smith saying that we are addicted to crises, I think I see that now. I didn't see that before. And what Phil was talking about, sign and symbol, I think when it's like the art of war, like trying to find the collective consciousness that people can read into something familiar in their own databases. And I look at the Nazi stuff, but I also look at Goya, who showed the horrors of war. And I think with Goya, he was kind of an attempt to raise people's consciousness. And the difference is one tries to manipulate and create clones, and one tries to create empathy.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you know, thinking about this and thinking about what Peter said earlier, you know, there's an issue that Kenneth talks about throughout this book, which is that, you know, Kierkegaard, I reread on Friday the saying from Kierkegaard where he's saying, you know, he looked around the world wondering what he could do to contribute to the world, and saw everywhere were all these brilliant, passionate people who were working to make life easier. And he thought, well, nobody needs me to do that because it's all being done. So maybe my job in life is to make everything harder. And you know, when you read Kierkegaard saying that, your first reaction is, what? Why would you do that? But, you know, he gradually unpacks the idea that maybe the things that come easiest to us are not the healthiest things. If the culture is structured in such a way to make the path of least resistance lead somewhere self-serving and profitable rather than healthy and sustainable, then things that in another epoch might have come easily to us instead come very hard to us. There's this tragic inversion. I spent a bunch of time reading about tragedy over the last week. You know, the peripeteia is a stage in every Greek tragedy, late in the tragedy, where everything that the hero does with their virtues that should have led to good outcomes instead leads to bad outcomes because the virtue is now functioning like a vice. It's in an unhealthy context. And so it's not some accident that causes the tragedy to happen, but it's the very best qualities of the hero that cause the tragedy to happen through the process of peripeteia, in which their strengths are used against them. And it's one of the things Kenneth talks about is the way that modernism uses the most important core existentialist survival traits that evolved in Homo sapiens against us. It uses culture against us. It uses psychology against us. It uses intelligence against us. It uses our personalities against us. It's all designed to prevent any escape and to turn everything back into somehow keeping the machine going to produce more profit. And as long as we don't recognize that that's happening, and as long as we don't see the bones and sinews and muscles and joints of the machinery, the organic machinery that makes that happen, we won't be able to stop it from happening. So there's a way in which, you know, we've talked about this before in a different angle. We've talked about why Kenneth uses difficult language because he says all of the easy language has been corrupted and it all leads us away from the truth. And not every single word, but only the most important words about the most important concepts required for our liberation as human beings and to become fully mature people. Those are all the words that modernism has turned inside out and pointed the opposite direction, so that freedom stops meaning anything specific and becomes an empty abstraction, so that we don't know how to bring it about in the world. So that adulthood only means that you hit 18 or 21 or whatever the cutoff is, and now magically you're an adult, regardless of how immature you are, regardless of how unfit. Now you're an adult. So now the word adulthood doesn't mean anything. Mature doesn't mean anything. And as you work your way through the list, you discover all the most important feature, character, personality, thinking, culture. These have all become empty abstractions that don't actually mean things. And I don't mean that they mean nothing, but they mean sort of juvenile caricature things that turn us away from the sinews of history, the sinews of our circumstances. They prevent us from anatomizing why things are the way that they are. And therefore, because we can't see clearly what's happening, we can't change it. And even if we weren't going to change it, we can't interact with it as adults. We can only interact with it as dependents because we're helpless. We've been taught to be helpless. So there's a way in which, and Kenneth is pretty upfront about this, when he's writing about philosophy, he's writing using harder words than most people would use even in philosophy. He's using them in different ways than most people would use them. And he's having to talk around subjects that he would rather talk directly at using simple language, but he can't, because the whole subject and all the language around it have been turned into a kind of gravity well that prevents us from seeing it clearly. It's sort of like an inside out black hole that obscures itself every time we approach it. So the things that he's doing with language and lines of argument, he's not saying this is how philosophy should be. Everybody should think the way I think. This is what I want to mass produce myself and stamp myself onto other people. He's not saying any of that. What he's saying is to try to get at the truth should be an easy thing, and in a healthy culture, it would be. But in an anti-culture that uses all of our strengths against us, all the easy paths lead the wrong way. That's what he's saying. And if we did the culture work and could restructure the culture so that the culture was actually helping us the way it's supposed to, could help us to see the things that matter most and to see their structure and their anatomy, then these things could be said easily. And they should be, because you want the path of least resistance in a culture to be for people to grow up to be healthy, mature human beings. You don't want the path of least resistance to be people grow up into mentally ill, infantilized productions of society, production units of society. That's why he calls modernism an anti-culture. It's turned inside out the goals of the culture, and it does it for profit because it's very profitable to deny people the things that make them healthy. So Phil, and then Stephen, and then Joseph, and Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I have a personal question to ask because
Yeah.
I'm a little confused.
Sure.
And then I have a comment based on the discussion. My personal question is, some of the things that's been said has confused me whether I'm reading the right book.
Sorry.
Okay, so I am reading Dramas of the Mind by Kenneth Smith. Is that the book we're in?
No.
No. Okay.
We're in Millennia and Microcosm.
Oh, okay. Because I was reading Nietzsche's Moral Empathy, Entropy.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got that clear now. I'm reading the wrong book, and that's why I'm not following some of the discussion. But on the other hand, I seem to have the ability to at least follow the discussion.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's good.
Right, Phil.
Well, yeah, right. The starting at the wrong point, but nonetheless, I followed the tactic that being employed. So I would say that in the discussion, I would nevertheless agree with Sharon that despite everything, that the modern culture is at least allows for more diversity and possibilities. Okay. And that even though what it does, unfortunately, is that it sort of shuts the door on the general population. I don't know how I been managed to be able to serve above, the advertising. It came at different stages. Perhaps one reason was because I did have a previous culture I lived in, and I could see the contrast, and maybe that's part of it. Perhaps it's because I study and practice art, and also study and practice design. And particularly the design part allowed me to enter into a kind of understanding of advertising and signs versus symbols. And perhaps that's one of the reasons, and particularly I also study very carefully typography, which is very abstract in its way because the alphabet is essentially constructed out of nothing. It's basically something that forces you to see abstractly to construct some at least sign within that system so that you could make sense in a sense out of originally nonsense. So therefore you're constructing a constructive mind in a sense.
Yeah.
Whatever reason, I think modern culture has become very confusing, and I admit that, and that's why it's bad for the culture in general. But I managed to escape it to at least some degree, and I think it's because it has forced us to see randomness and to not focus on the particulars,
Yeah.
but to see a pattern in the randomness, because the conflict with the randomness itself may reveal a deeper shadow, if you call it that way,
Yes.
that allows you to see something beyond that. And that sort of ability to see somewhat out of focus allows you to focus on the ground in which it lies on. So
Right.
as you notice, you focus on something and the ground is very blurry, but allows you to then, turn the lens and you could begin to see the ground emerging somewhat. So that whole relationship to the figure ground has been important to me in terms of understanding that at the top level, they are signs, and that you have to see between the sign and how it relates to the ground,
Yeah.
see the symbol behind it. And
Yeah.
so I don't know. And I think that's, unfortunately, that excludes people who can't see the relationship between figure ground.
Mm-hmm.
And as an example, it puts you in a position that's sort of work to your advantage, but also uncomfortable, because it sort of makes you a kind of elitist, right? I could see it, you can't. How do I
Yes.
now get other people to see that relationship
Yes.
when they're focused merely on the objects in the ground that are
Yes.
very confusing? And so I think that means there's a natural divide between you and the general public, which is
Yes.
sort of uncomfortable, because you
Yes.
want to be with them,
Yes.
but they do not have the instrument. And when you try to convince them, it's like no, they're not convinced. And so you're constantly trying to equivocate between being with them and being outside of them, which is
Right.
sort of also uncomfortable. And that's what I mean about the equivocation. That's why I stood in the city walls,
Yes.
because you're constantly equivocating between the two, and because you can't be in one and another. And I'll remind you, I think I told this story before, when I was visiting artists back at San Jose State, when I was where I was originally. I started as a student. And there was some terrible art showing in the galleries. And I one day had a chance to talk to the gallery director that directed all of that stuff. Yeah. So we were roughly the same age, and we were sort of friends. And I talked to her, and then finally I said, well, why are the shows always so lousy? She gave all sort of excuses, the dean, the art council, the art department, all of that stuff. And so finally, after a while, we talked. I said, well, then you're selling out, because your purpose should be about what aesthetics about. And she gave an answer that is typical of being in the same problem of equivocating. She says, no, I'm buying in.
Yeah.
So one is always that force. Are you going to sell out? Are you going to stay outside and criticize, or are you going to buy in? Because your survival depends on buying in. And I remember telling that story to my nephew, and I jokingly accused him when he started accepting a job as a teacher. I said, "Oh, so does everybody have to sell out?" He says, "Uncle Phil, no, I'm buying in." He has used my argument against myself, which is sort of interesting. I don't think he's actually sold out, but he just sort of used that counter example. So there it is. So I think one is force. I think there's a lot of people who have sold out, who are forced to buy in by the system itself, because and once they bought in, then they almost have to stay in
Yeah.
order to stay in. So
yeah, once again, whole lot of great material there. We'll probably be talking about it for months to come.
say the book again.
Millennia in Microcosm. Millennia in Microcosm. He's talking about 3,000 years of history
Okay.
in one book.
Okay. Thanks. I'll try to find it.
Sure.
Was that posted on the website?
Yes.
Yeah, it was on the invite.
Okay.
Dramas of the Mind was his first column that he did for the Comics Journal. Millennia, and in it he wrote about whatever philosophical topics interested him at the time. But Millennia in Microcosm was his second one, and he had a clear design for the whole thing.
Okay.
Which is that he wanted to talk about this idea of how can we understand who we are if we don't know what modernism is. So we are moderns, but we don't know what that means. And part of the reason that we don't know what that means is that we wouldn't be able to understand that unless we were able to see it from more perspectives than just the modern perspective. So
well, thanks for clearing that up for me. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. And now the issue of aristocratism and hierarchical relationships between people is going to be a recurring theme. It's going to come up, and it is the first thing I was really uncomfortable about in Kenneth Smith's writing when I first started interacting with him. I've made my peace more or less with it and worked it out, but it took many years. So it's going to come up explicitly when he talks about the ancient order, because the ancients were unapologetically hierarchical. They did not, unlike the medievals and unlike the moderns, they did not pretend we are one great brotherhood of man who are all equal. They said, well, anybody looking at people can see that we're not equal. It's just obvious. And in modernism, you're not supposed to say that or think that. It's like, it's verboten. You're touching the third rail. If you disagree with Thomas Jefferson in his opening lines about, everyone's created equal, it's like, yeah, but well, then why are some people blind? Why are some people deaf? Why are some people cruel? Why are some people, it's right off the bat, we can see that we're not equal. But it's because of the way that we structured in modernism, where equality is the justification for rights. And the threat is that if we're not equal, then maybe we're not going to let some people have rights. And that's right in the Constitution when they say, oh, but Black people aren't equal, so that's why they get to be slaves. And that's why when slavery was banned by the US Constitution, it still had an out for slavery and said, unless they've committed certain crimes, in which case they can still be slaves. So again, modernism promises this idea that you get rights because you're equal, which makes us all nervous to talk about the fact that we're not. But then with the other hand, at the exact same time, it's pulling back some of the rights from some of the people. So core to the aristocratic idea in its clean form, not in its Roman form that Augustine so properly critiqued, is the idea that what if human rights shouldn't depend on equality? What if we could have diversity and still people deserve to be treated well? Just because somebody is born autistic shouldn't mean that, well, since now we're not equal, we get to pull all their rights away. Maybe people deserve dignity not because of equality, but because they deserve dignity. There's like a whole other discussion to have around the unequalness of people and justice and all these things. And it's going to take a while to talk about because it flies in the face of our dogma. But that discomfort you're feeling was the discomfort I felt the first time I talked to him about this, and he talked about the hierarchical relationships among people. So I'm like, no hierarchies, we're all equal. He's like, I hear your dogma talking, but that's not the truth. And everybody knows it's not the truth. We just are programmed not to talk about it. So we'll come back to that a lot. It's a whole can of worms. Stephen, then Joseph, then Sharon, then MJ. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can justify the concept that Smith is an exponent of progress. I'll just say progress. Progress in the modern sense is an idea which arose in the 18th century. I'm not saying there weren't attitudes to progress prior to that. Lessing's education of the human race is a very, very good idea of what became the modern concept of progress. And that pervaded the 19th century, where the change in technology was so extremely rapid that everything was changing within a few years, a whole of life. We haven't experienced change at the pace people experienced it, say, between 1850 and 1950.
Yeah.
We know nothing like it. We're almost the same 50 years later compared to the huge amount of change which occurred between those dates around the year 1900. But where could you justify that Kenneth Smith is a progressive?
Yeah, so that is a lengthy discussion, but let's see if I can do the short version. And remember that I would only argue that he's a progressive in the same breath that I'd argue he's a reactionary, and in the same breath that I'd say he's none of those things. It's a paradoxical relationship. So take what I'm about to say, not with a grain of salt, but with an understanding that it's only part of a paradox, and it doesn't make sense without the other parts. But it's based on the Hegelian notion that the dialectic in nature is about growth. That the bud to the blossom to the fruit is a teleological series of unfoldings of order. And that the reason, and this is something you're not supposed to say under modernist scientific orthodoxy, but the reason a tree puts forth buds is in order to produce the fruit that produces the seeds that produces new trees. If it didn't allow for the propagation of the species, trees wouldn't do it. There is a directionality, there is an intention. But this has to be separated from the 18th century notion of progress, which has entirely different goals. If in terms of the 18th century and thus 20th and 21st century notions of progress, you couldn't call him a progressive. But in terms of the idea that you should make value judgments, you must make value judgments about what you think, your character, how you act in the world, your communities, your culture, your history. You must evaluate these things. That creates a differential between the worse and the better, as Aristotle would put it. And that we have a duty as human beings to strive to try to do less of the worst and more of the better. And that is a kind of progressive that's a very counter-modern kind of progressive. It wouldn't fit comfortably. It would only fit comfortably with the modern notion of progressivism if you didn't look at it too closely. But the more closely you look at it, the more it can sometimes look like progressiveness and sometimes look like reactionariness and sometimes look like neither of those things. Because it's not oriented along the dimensions that the modern political parties orient themselves around. It's oriented in an entirely different way.
Okay, I'll take that all as a no. Kenneth Smith doesn't have the slightest elements of the modern progressive in him. He's back there with Plato, or he's back there with Francis Bacon.
He's got some things in common with Heraclitus or Aristotle, but not Plato. Plato was sort of an anti-progressive. He took after Parmenides in denying the reality of change and saying that change is an illusion. And Kenneth would say, no, change is real. Change is definitely real. And that it's a mistake if we say that we are, because it creates the illusion of stasis. And the truth is that we are becoming.
I'll take that as a no. There's nothing of the modern progressive in Kenneth Smith.
There is and isn't at the same time. It all depends on how you measure it. But sure, that is a legitimate interpretation. Is it Joseph, then Sharon, then MJ, then Donald, or did the line shift?
It's Joseph's turn.
Okay, go ahead, Joseph.
Just really quick to just comment on what was just said briefly. I found that it's increasingly difficult to label something or someone in general. Yes. So that, that's something that, in reading the Tao, you start to realize how challenging that really is.
Yes.
So to say someone's progressive or not is sometimes it just makes it too simple, which goes to my other point, is this idea of simplicity that we were talking about a little bit earlier. It's, the Kierkegaard quote that you had mentioned is interesting because it's that people are always trying to make what easier, to begin with. And that I was in a discussion recently that we talked about the idea of the inverted self.
Yes.
And the inverted self was this idea of that it was a conversation about form follows function, but how people attach themselves to the forms and the systems that they're actually in versus actually thinking about the functions of what they're actually doing. So because if they thought about the functions, that they would it would be harder because you would have to change, and you'd have to really, if you had an ethical compass, let's just say,
Right.
and just you would actually think about it in the terms of what am I doing and why am I doing this? Is it polluting the planet? What's the what's the purpose behind this? And instead, people are just making things. And I think this is a distinction between efficiency and effectiveness, right? You do things just to be efficient within a system. You're making things easier, but you're not making things better.
Right.
And so that, whereas effectiveness is actually working on the idea of the function versus where you're making things actually better.
Right.
So it's a really important concept to kind of call out. And I think sometimes, from what I'm just reading a little bit here, and I'm catching up in the modernity aspect of things, that yes, sometimes we look to efficiency and we as opposed to effectiveness, and this is actually how we focus on the forms, and the forms themselves, the forms of a system. But it goes to also a little bit, and I had to step away with, and I kind of forget, it was the ground and figure in the ground, how I'll come back to that later, but how we don't have necessarily the instruments to even understand the way the forms work in certain cases. And I think that that's very true, because in school, and if you think about it in school in general, we're really not taught, we're only taught the forms and how to function within those forms and how to solve those problems, but not necessarily how to really think about this, a problem in general, and how to approach that. So I do appreciate the fact that when we're talking about making things harder is a very, very deep and important concept, because it's not making things harder just to make things harder. Obviously, it's making things harder so that we understand why our functions are the way they are. And then I think in that comes back to my original point. It gets really hard to label anything within that framework.
Right.
So anyway, that was a long tangent, and I need to finish reading this. I'm going through it as we're talking. But anyway, those are just some comments that I wish to share.
Yeah, that's good material. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think about Flatland and the model of the two-dimensional inhabitants trying to explain what happens when a sphere passes through Flatland from the third dimension, and a dot seems to appear from nowhere, and then it grows into a circle, and then it shrinks back to a dot, and then it disappears. And that's what they think happened, because they can't conceive of the idea of a third dimension passing through their plane. It's inconceivable. So, their attempts to explain the phenomenon are all wrong, all of them, because they're missing an entire dimension of existence that would be required to make sense out of what just occurred. Now, it can be mapped onto their existence, and they do have explanations that make sense to them of the phenomena as they experienced it. And those explanations might even work within the frame of Flatland. They might even be more useful within the frame of Flatland. It might be useless to think about a third dimension if you can't actually ever experience it. But it doesn't make it any more true. And it's so massively distorting that in some ways, the satisfaction and effectiveness and usefulness produced by these bad explanations are worse than having no explanation at all, because it cuts them off from inquiry. They stop asking questions because they have the answer that they want. And why would you belabor this by going any further? This is what it's like to try to experience Kenneth Smith when you have a lifetime telling you that freedom and law and justice and human nature are all very, very simple things, really simple things, and that you already have all the tools you need to understand human existence. And if you just don't rock the boat and don't bite the hand that feeds you and go about your life, everything will be fine. So it's not, if we knew that we didn't have the tools, we might, at least some of us, be driven to seek them out. But if we think we've got them already and they seem to explain everything, then it is a better barrier to explanation than any obstacle that could be raised against, our ability to understand. There's the more you think you're already done, the more dangerous it is for any prospect of you ever figuring out that you haven't even started. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is the way that modernism mass produces personalities. We talk about the prospects for freedom. And the thing that's interesting about modernism is that on the one hand, with all this technology, there's all kinds of things we could do, but we don't do most of them because we've been mass produced. So we use them in stereotypical ways. And that mass production represents a degree of control that human governments and cultures have never had before in the history of the world. This is the thing that's unique about modernism. Our power over other human beings has been industrialized. It's been scientized and turned into mass Xerox machines and systems of manufacturing consent. And that makes it so that even though in theory modernism tells you that you're free to think whatever you want, it's very hard to do. But in the medieval era, even though you were told you may not think whatever you want, we'll kill you if you think certain things, you must obey, their power to enforce compliance was so inferior that if you were just not stupid, and if you were careful about who you told what to, you had a greater realm of possible freedom of thought, because they couldn't figure out what you were thinking. And because you hadn't been mass produced in the first place, you could be much more strange as a person in the medieval epoch and never get caught, as long as you learned the simple outward forms that you had to obey. But in the modern era, you can't even start rebelling until after you've already been formatted, at which point your ideas about rebellion mostly involve conforming with other ideas about rebellion that you've been provided, that all handily trail you right back into the system. So this is what I mean. There's a paradox, right? Are we more free or less free? Is there greater diversity or less diversity? The answer is a paradox. It's both at the same time, but not in an abstract way, in a very specific way that has articulation and bones and muscles and only bends in certain directions. There are ways where if you dig into this, you can better understand the nature of freedom of itself by seeing how it's inverted between the medieval epoch and the modern epoch. That's part of what he's trying to do in this book.
So, and really quickly, just one quick addition is that, yeah, you can really see, and I was actually just thinking the same thing with the idea of industrialization or technology and how you become formatted within that framework. And then how you have to basically be able to distinguish the separation from what actually you're doing,
yeah,
versus what you're actually trying to accomplish. And so, I mean, and this inability to make that distinction actually distorts our perspectives on reality. And so we're almost designed to fail in a way. And so we're just trying to revisit that. And I'm assuming that's what Sese is going for.
Yeah, that's where this book's going to go.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Sharon, then MJ, then Marianne, then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
I would just like to introduce a slightly different concept. Please. In reading these Kenneth Smith essays in the time I've been with you, I've come away with the impression that Kenneth Smith is a perspectivalist. If I'm making up that word, I don't know.
Yeah.
Rather than a progressive. And in his perspective, it's hard for me to find the optimism. right? But what I do find is the consciousness raising. So
Yes.
one of my favorite books that I read is by Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, which is the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress. And that book starts around the 18th century. And what he does is he applies data to all the changes that has occurred in time. It's a fantastic book. And so in reading Kenneth Smith, I go back and I look at the time period after the 18th century, and I look at Kenneth's gloom and doom and see what else happened then. For example, during the medieval period, he focuses exclusively on Christianity. But so many other things happened at that time. And what caught my eye was that we had the Black Plague, which lasted 3 years, and which we had a lot of scientific development that came from that. But he just focuses solely on the cultural implications of Christianity and religion and its rigidity and how it impacted the culture at that time. So I think all the features, in fact, that's also the time period in which we had the Crusades, so I can hardly blame him for that. But in fact, I think some of the good things or the productive things got left behind.
Yes.
And so you can comment on that for me.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, what you're going to see in Millennia and Microcosm is not the full picture of what Kenneth Smith thinks about the medieval epoch. He's really going to talk about it in terms of its relationship to the ancient and the modern. And as such, he's going to be focusing on certain kinds of continuity and certain kinds of contrast. But the picture is so much bigger. So for example, it's during the medieval epoch that science is invented, not in Europe, but in the Arab world, right? In counter-reaction against the ancient rationalists, the Arabs were forced to invent science to figure out which of the things that they had always revered that came from these Greek writers turned out to be bullshit. It's like this massive trauma. I mean, I can't begin to suggest the level of cultural trauma it was to find that your heroes were screwing up an enormous amount of the time, and that the specific vehicle of their screw up was the thing that everybody prided themselves on the most. Logic, reason, rationality, intellect, mathematics, all these things that they thought were the pinnacle turned out to lead to error more often than not. It wasn't until you tied it to empiricism and testing things in the world that you could weed out the 90% of perfectly reasonable, highly convincing ideas that were nevertheless 100% wrong. And of course, that didn't happen in Europe at all, right? Europe had to import that first surreptitiously to avoid being burned at the stake, and then eventually increasingly openly, right? So, you know, he's going to touch on that, but he's not really going to focus on it. In doing so, he's not trying to be a European ethnocentrist, because you get him talking about the Arabs and the discovery of science, and he's passionate.
Excuse me, can we have a link for that one?
For which?
I know it sounds terrible to ask for a link, but this idea that the Arabs or whatever discovered the mistakes of the Greeks.
Yes. We could do a whole session on that.
I don't know. Is there a link which could, throw some light on that for me?
I'll bring some next week. Next week. I got to do the research. I have a list of names of various, and I say Arab, but really there's also Persian and Syrian scholars. Within the Arab world, there were a group of scholars who were translators of the Greeks and were trying to keep it from being lost. They were seeing the Dark Age in Europe, and they were frustrated, and they were trying to make sure that.
Okay, I've diverted you from what you're doing, but thanks. Yeah, if you can, please.
Yeah, I'll find that stuff for you. Yeah. So, and of course, one of the things that's difficult for us is that as moderns, we come pre-programmed with a lot of very strong opinions about the Dark Ages. For example, we call them the Dark Ages. And that was a bit of marketing. That was done on purpose. That was part of the Protestant Reformation to recast the previous Catholic era as an era of ignorance. and to cast the new Protestant era as embracing science and enlightenment. There's a reason we call it the Enlightenment. All these things together were part of the big push against the centralized church that happened right around the transition. So we come in full of these feelings that we don't even talk about that era, pre-formatted to see it in certain ways. And so there's sort of some remedial work that's going on over the decades in archaeology, where they're rediscovering things about the Dark Ages that weren't half as dark as we thought they were. And it's hard for us because it flies in the face of our programming. But if you follow medieval archaeology over the decades, what you'll gradually find is more and more discoveries that show people were doing brain surgery, people were building really complex machines. There was science going on, but it had to be out of the eyesight of the church. There was a tremendous amount that was happening that we weren't told about because it didn't fit the propaganda that the modern era needed to overthrow the era of ignorance. We're the era of enlightenment, they're the era of stupidity and ignorance. We're the era of freedom, they're the era of dogma. We have to find the modern era by what we're not, by not being them. So talking about the medieval epoch is really hard because all over the place, we're trying to overcome prejudices that have been instilled in us. Kenneth isn't going to tackle all of them in his writing, but he tackles some of them. And some of the prejudices that he tackles are the ones that I was least ready, on a personal level, that I was least ready to have tackled. Because, for example, he investigates the topics of the soul and the spirit and shows how it might not be nonsense. There might be really important things to talk about the nature of how human psychology works, that you can't understand if you just throw all that stuff out as being gibberish. That, for 1,000 years, people were working really hard to understand what makes people tick. And, we got to look into that stuff if we're going to try to talk intelligently. So I'm with you. You're not going to find everything here. There's going to be
my only question was what he left out, if it detracted from his analysis by focusing just on religion. And I have one other question here, and that is help with the timeline. The ancient period is from 3000 BC to 500 AD, correct?
Roughly.
Somewhere around there, give or take. And when we say medieval, we're looking at 1,000 years from 1400 to 1450. Am I correct about that? So the Dark Ages is 400 AD to 1400, to the start of the medieval times. I'm not a history student, so I'm trying to get a perspective of it here.
Sure.
I need help with that.
So different medieval historians will organize it differently, but generally speaking, the medieval epoch is usually defined roughly from the fall of Rome. That's usually where even though there was continuity, and even though there were, medieval things rising before that, it's such a clear line in history. It's just handy, and it obscures as much as it reveals, because of course it wasn't a line. There was a long period of transformation, and in some ways there are parts of the ancient ethos and worldview, as he says, that are still contained in the modern, that are still fragments floating around inside of our culture. So, but yes, roughly from the fall of Rome until around the 1400s to 1500s, there's a number of different events you can choose as the end. Different historians pick different ones. But he sort of puts the beginning of the end around Pico della Mirandola first putting out, such a clear statement. Martin Luther nailing his theses on the church is another turning point. Some people take it all the way to 1848. And the reason they take it to 1848 is that was a year when a whole bunch of European monarchies fell in the same year. And so it's another convenient line. But the problem is it's way too late. Most of the features of modernism were already really well established centuries before 1848. It's far too late. So this is the problem one has when one's trying to draw lines. The lines are all abstractions. They're only really good as models.
Also, didn't a Renaissance period occur after medieval period? I mean, don't historians very often talk about the Renaissance period coming after the Middle Ages, right?
Most historians put the Renaissance immediately after the medieval era. And of course, it's challenging because some of the features of the Renaissance, like in art, were developed centuries before that during what they're calling the medieval period. And conversely, the Inquisition, which most people think is a medieval thing, happened during the Renaissance. It was during modernism that we really became efficient at stomping out heresies. But the stomping out of heresies is one of the defining characteristics of the medieval era. So you see what I mean about these lines. They're difficult, but they make more sense if we talk about them as Hegel does, as the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. This is stages of development, and there's no line between the stages. There's continuity and transformation. And it's like the Greeks, when they talked about the biographies of people, would not talk about their birth and death dates. They talked about which were the years when they were most characteristically themselves. Fluctuate is the word that people use. This is when they flourished, when they were at the height of their powers. It's often easier to figure out where the height of the powers of one of these eras is than it is to figure out where the boundaries are, because there aren't really any boundaries. There's a process of transformation. So I know that's a murky answer to your question, Sharon, but it's a murky topic.
Yes. Yes. Can I just say one more thing before we go? I want to follow up on what Joseph, where is he? Joseph said when he says form follows function.
Yeah.
I don't know if follows is the word, or I like to say implicates function. And that's what caught my eye about this word physiocratic.
Yes.
This economic theory, because the guy who designed it, Quesnay, and his buddy Nemours, Quesnay is a physician, and he came up with the physiocratic theory based on physiocratic economic theory based on the flow of blood in the body and how nature and the land should be. And I read that thing for a good half an hour, and I found it absolutely fascinating. He thought the world should be designed based on nature, how nature was.
Yes.
The trees, the body, the flow of the fluid or the substance that maintained our life. That's how our economy should be designed. And it all came back to the land. And I think he was the first guy who stressed the importance of labor, because that's who we were.
So he's borrowing that term, physiocratic, and applying it here.
Me.
I'm not going to. You still have learned a great deal that's going to be interesting and apply to this. So he's attempting in his economic theory to embody the physiocratic ideas of the Greeks, but the physiocratic ideas go far more broadly than that theory. In fact, the Greeks didn't have that theory the way that he has it. They didn't use money the way he's talking about using it. But the core idea that nature should be the driver, and that you have to pay attention to how nature works, and you should model your societies and cultures after nature. That's what his theory shares with their perspective. So it was time well spent reading up on that. It's just not an exact match.
Okay.
So many good things to talk about, but I'm gonna turn to the other people in line. MJ, then Marianne, then Phil. Go ahead, MJ.
Okay, two things. First, really fast is, as I read this and listen to modernism, I have to just raise the term capitalism, which in my mind is the 800-pound elephant if you're talking about modernism in the United States. It's, in my mind, 180 degrees opposite, talking about what benefits people, society, health, everything except money. Right. So I think it's, founding a country on capitalism and not looking at the negative impacts of it is really dangerous. I think we'd have a completely different discussion if maybe the modernism under discussion was in Finland. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just to prove the value and the worthiness of the trends that Kenneth talks about is this microcosm of the future of the digital revolution, which started in like 93 with internet in a box and everybody's online and we got highways. It did the same thing as the Industrial Revolution, which was things are going to be easier, they're
Mhm.
going to be faster.
Mhm.
And one of the things that gets shortened is the perception of time.
Yeah.
Time speeds up. You know, the Victorian London, you could get mail twice a day. Well, now we have people whose perception of time is instantaneous.
Mhm.
And they're carrying with them the necessity of this. And one of the things it cuts down is, and goes back to Kenneth, is the speed at which ideas are delivered and the speed at which people have time to process the ideas.
Mhm.
You know, the Gettysburg Address would have been different if it had been delivered now. So
Yeah.
those were my 2 points.
Thank you. So, capitalism. You know, Kenneth Smith on Marx is interesting because he refuses to be for him or against him. His take on Marx, like his take on any other philosopher, is to try to see what they're saying from their own perspective, and then to use not only their perspective to look at other philosophers, but to use other philosophers' perspectives to look at them. And so our problem is that, you know, coming out of the Cold War, we all want to take sides. Are you for or against Marxism? That's the most important question. Most people can't even talk about the subject until they figure out where everybody stands, for or against. And here too, as with what Stephen raised with the progressive versus reactionary, you know, Kenneth Smith comes down in the uncomfortable position of not being interested in playing in our little sandboxes. He doesn't want to be for or against Marx. He wants to use Marx where Marx is useful, and he wants to critique Marx where Marx is not useful. And the combination of those things successfully enrages everybody by the time he's done, because people have such strong feelings about it. So, you know, his take on Marx is, yeah, Marx is a dialectician. He was a young Hegelian. He takes a certain amount of that. He tries to bring a certain naturalistic, you know, obeying natural law, looking at natural law, an existentialist perspective on the economy, and he was able to do a great deal because of that. But his strength is also his weakness. He tends to talk about culture as though it is an epiphenomenon, like a mist rising off the swamp. Interesting, but not central, right? Is one of the things that Marx repeatedly says over and over about culture. And the problem with that is, if everything was as straight cut as Marx says it was, if it is only the material conditions that drive history, then why, when the material conditions are so bad, do people not move on to the next stage of history? Why do they keep staying in the circumstances they're in? You say, well, Marx talks about false consciousness, and that part of Marx is really interesting, but then he doesn't somehow make the false consciousness central to his theory. So there's a way in which he acknowledges Hegel's understanding that the way we think, the way our characters form, the way our communities and cultures form are incredibly powerful on us on the one hand, and yet somehow not powerful enough to drive history in any meaningful way. So he ends up caught in a contradiction.
Well, it's a classic, isn't it a classic economics proverb that all other things being equal?
Ceteris
He's
paribus.
studying economics. He says, hey, society, you're on your own.
That's right. That's right. Ceteris paribus. And in this way, you know, ironically, what you've just set up for me is to be able to say, this is how Kenneth Smith criticizes modernism, modern democracy, capitalism, modern forms of science, and Marx himself as moderns being guilty of worshiping at the altar of ceteris paribus. The foreground backgrounds, shifting of priorities that's done automatically under ceteris paribus is an immense form of violence to the subject. If Socrates says we have a duty to the rights of the question whenever we're addressing a question, then the use of ceteris paribus allows us to pretend to be doing rights to the question while actually suppressing all the parts we don't want to talk about. We just say, oh, that's just all else being equal. And the problem with ceteris paribus in a nutshell is, in order to know if all else is equal, we would have to know all else. We'd have to be omniscient. For ceteris paribus to be a legitimate principle to be applied, we would have to be God. And every time that we apply the ceteris paribus principle, we are effectively dressing ourselves up as God and saying, yes, I know all there is in the universe, so you can trust me when I tell you that only this part is important and relevant to this question. And in so doing, it is a massive act of hubris that is, on the one hand, incredibly juvenile, But on the other hand, one of the defining characteristics of modernism, which considers itself the most adult, most objective form of culture that ever existed. So his critique on Marx is there's a lot of interesting stuff in Marx, but not enough to justify embracing it as an ideology, because you shouldn't embrace any ideology. And what you're going to find is that, you know, the weak spots are just as interesting as the strong spots. The other major critique on Marx is that so many Marxists since Marx took the simple part and left out the complicated part. So they embrace the idea that everything is economics, and then they look away from the things he had to say about false consciousness, alienation, and so forth. The cultural stuff that's so important, but that Marx didn't put at the center of his theory. A lot of Marxists have said, well, since he didn't put it at the center of his theory, I can, ceteris paribus, I can safely disregard that part. And now it's all money. And the only thing that matters is the class struggle, the revolution, and moving on to the next system, which is why so many of the systems that were created in the wake of ostensibly Marxist revolutions ended up still being completely modernist, still driven by metrics and numbers and artificial categories, and not actually doing justice to the needs of human beings and the needs of the ecosystems of the earth. Why are some of the worst environmental disasters in the world in the Soviet Union, which was supposed to be a counter response against capitalism and overthrowing the evils of capitalism? And yet there they are, dutifully recreating Chernobyl and all these other horrible waste dumps that we make. You know, for every horrible act of ecocide that we committed in the United States, there's another act of ecocide somewhere in the Soviet Union or China, where they have an entire lake full of toxic metals as a byproduct of the computer industry. They just pump all of the waste. There's just this vast area in which nothing can grow. And, you know, these are not actual alternatives. They're just alternative forms that are fighting about the wrong things and are not actually addressing the core issues that cause us to keep recreating these same modernist Achilles heels in our societies over and over and over. And we keep doing it because, as we said at the beginning of this, the very tools we're trying to use to understand our circumstances are the tools provided for us by our circumstances. And they're forcing us to think in the wrong way about what our problem is, and therefore to create the wrong solutions to our problem. Yeah, Marx, right? So you'll see Kenneth Smith criticize capitalism up one side and down the other. He's a vicious critic of capitalism. And then, to the discomfort of so many anti-capitalists, he'll turn around and do the same thing to the Soviet Union and China, you know, and all these other places, and say they have not solved the modernist problem either. They've just created alternative forms of modernist orthodoxy. There is a deeper problem that we have not yet come to grips with. That's his. I think that if he had to sum up in just a few words, I think that would be the summation of his take on capitalism and anti-capitalist movements. And of course, I guess I can't leave without saying the other piece of this, which is that capitalism, like any other economic system, is an organism. It is a form of culture that we have generated, and we did not form it ex nihilo. It derived from its predecessors, and it grew organically from its predecessors. It was necessitated. It had to follow. The things that we did in the medieval epoch made it necessary to move to capitalism. And it's only what is necessitated during the development of capitalism that's going to replace it. Whatever it isn't going to be we snap our fingers and have a revolution and we get to have our utopia. It's not going to be somebody scripted in a book. I think these are my great ideas and I'm going to impose them. So all of that is still modernism again, acting out. Whatever is going to come next is going to grow out of it in some way. And it's growing right now. But just as the medievals couldn't see modernism growing in their very midst in the medieval era, because they saw with medieval eyes, in the same way as moderns, we can't see what's growing inside of us that's going to become the next big thing because we look at ourselves with modern eyes. This is why what Kenneth Smith is doing, rather than being utopian or totalitarian or fascist or any of the other, kind of easy judgments, what he's doing is, as Sharon said, perspectivalist. He's saying the only chance we have to see what's coming is to learn to look at ourselves not as moderns look at ourselves, because that's where all the blind spots are that are hiding the thing that's growing. By learning to see with medieval eyes, by learning to see with ancient eyes, and then by extension, once we've developed the skill set, learning to see with other eyes, indigenous eyes, I mean, how many different perspectives are there to bring to bear? Somewhere in there, among those perspectives, the blind spots that are hiding the future from us will be removed and come into focus. And we may not be able to put the pieces together, but the pieces will start to appear in a way that they can't, as long as we stay inside any single perspective, especially a modern one. So that's sort of the big picture of where we're going with this. Marianne, then Phil. Go ahead, Marianne.
I wanted to address what MJ said about Finland. And I think Finland does have a kinder form of, I don't want to say capitalism, but I think that Viking Economics was a good book. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about was how form follows function is used a lot in my my profession.
Yeah.
And it is almost sacred. And to get people to sit down and tell you what they want so you can build something that they actually will use is really hard. That sense of consciousness is really hard to come. The architectural program is really, really hard because one thing, you want to project what you think your style or your stuff is on them. And then you have to step back and go, no, this doesn't really work for them.
That's right.
And to give an example is like right now, I'm working with younger people. And for me, my idea was an open kitchen with where people could congregate, you know, people could have a bar to sit down and talk. That is old school. Now the young people want an office. They want like little galley kitchens and they want an office so they can work at home, and they want to buy their baked salads and go to Costco and get their meals for a week. The kitchen is almost a footnote.
Right.
And I think that what is really interesting about form follow function is like when you get people to really understand what they want, you get into their desires. And in that sense of desire, you create like a wormhole into time and you get to build the future.
Yes.
And it's really a marvelous thing when you hit it right.
Yes. Yes. Same thing is true in the medical informatics community. You know, good medical software only happens when we're constantly, relentlessly talking to the people who are going to use the software and finding out what are their lives like, what are their jobs like, what are they trying to do. And what we discovered is that if you ask the users to tell you in abstracto what they think good software would look like, it'll be a terrible design. But if you ask them to tell you what their lives are like and what their needs are, then you can, together, you can create a great design. You know, because what's happening is the experience of their lives informs their gnosis. They build up this experiential understanding of their life. That in many ways, it's richer and more profound, but also not as expressible as the abstract ideas that are also running around in their head. And so the more you can get them to ignore their abstract ideas and focus on what their life is like and what their needs are, that's where the source of good software comes from, just like with what you're talking about with good architecture. And it's because what you're managing to do together is you're finding a way to harness the gnosis of large numbers of people that normally they wouldn't. Normally they've been trained to ignore that subjectivity of what their lives are like. They've been taught that it doesn't matter and that only ideas and systems and rules matter. But if you can somehow, you know, put all that on hold and let them express that gnosis, then what seeps through it is a bunch of real world truths digested through their lives that then inform the designs of the architecture of the software and make a better world. That there is what you're describing is a very heuristic phenomenon. It is a way to sort of feel a little bit what Vernunft is like. It's like because Vernunft is a way to bring together the abstract systematic design ideas with the experience of life, the less verbal, less systematized experience of life, to bring the truth through that experiential side to inform and help shape the intellectual design side. And that's where you get the harnessing together that creates the potential for Vernunft. I mean, in modernism, none of us ever get to see Vernunft in action, truly. but through these kinds of things you're describing, and you can see it in medicine a lot too, you get a way to sort of approximate, maybe get as close to as a modern can get, as seeing what it must have been like to be able to do Vernunft. What must the adult mind be like? It would do more of that sort of thing, and less of the sorts of things that we do when we're voting or buying or what have you. So thank you for bringing that up, Marianne. It's good stuff. Phil, then Joseph, then Sharon. So Phil, go ahead.
I have 3 points to make, unfortunately. The first point should be easy.
Sure.
Things go through a transitional period, because when you talk about when did the moderns became the moderns, you know, Rome fell, but the Roman Empire didn't fall until Byzantium fell as well, right? And that was in 1453.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, it roughly matched Copernicus' sun-centered universe, which was between 1508 to 1514. And 1408, I think, and 1414.
Yes.
And then Gutenberg printing, which was the advent of mass reproduction, production of understanding. That was 1448. So I mean, they're very roughly coincidental.
Yes.
With the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. So that's sort of interesting. So I always tell my students, remember 1450. There are many things. That was the date, by the way, that Martin Luther was born. So that was going to have its consequences later. And so that's the first point. My second point was that it kind of, this sort of modern evolution in the 19th century really evolved between and Hegel. Hegel remains quite religious.
Yes.
I think he think that it could be saved. He didn't want to give up that part because that was the moral part. And so if culture evolves, then there was two kind of camps. The more sort of conservative camp that sort of believe in this sort of idealism of trying to save what's there. And I think that was a problem. But on the other hand, there was the more progressive camp who says if history was evolving, and particularly if religion is becoming moribund, should we take it into our own hands and export it as take action under praxis to help it along? And that camp, Marx belongs to that camp. In other words, don't just like wait for it to evolve and whatever, you have to activate it into praxis. So that was important. So how you divided those camps. And so there was a lot of stuff, and not only Marx, but many, many people who began to realize that we have to get our hands busy, not just think about things, but actually do things. And so that begins to affect politics in a sense. So, and the third thing I want to say is, I just have a kind of further comment on what Joseph said earlier between efficiency and effectiveness. That's an important dialectic, I must admit. But the problem with that, it's not a problem, but wrapped with that is a bunch of micro dialectics. And my thought was the dialectic of efficiency and exploitation. In order to be efficient, you have to exploit, okay? Exploit something.
Yeah.
And it turns out that further had a dialectic between exploitation and oppression, because who are you going to exploit? Somebody, and they're going to be oppressed, okay? Mm-hmm. And then oppression has a dialectic within it that's human rights, right? You're oppressing these people, they have their rights, right? Why are you oppressing them?
Right.
And then human rights, then underneath that is the liberation of the human being, of others, I would say. And that then finally you could get back to effectiveness because it affects all of us, right? So there's micro steps you have to go through to unfold the grander dialectic of efficiency versus effectiveness, right? Because it will only be effective for some people if you just skip to that stage. But exploitation, human rights, oppression, and others, I mean, all that is wrapped up in the mini dialectic that it need to be incorporated. As a matter of fact, now there is that, the youth who are being oppressed, the outside of the system in a way, they're the one that's more interested in the effectiveness of taking care of the environment. That they always say, you know, us boomers, you know, I would like them to count me out, but nonetheless, they sort of have a right to say that. You know, we thought we were the activists, but we have begun to buy in. We have already bought in. Let's put it that way. And so therefore, we are oppressing them. So certainly their future, you know, we sold out their future because we want to buy in to our present. So I think that you have to think it in a sort of more micro way about the dialectic. That's why I go back and I still admire what Sharon said, despite the confusion, if you could sort out these steps of micro dialectics, that democracy is kind of important to unfold that. Democracy in conjunction with praxis, as well as the dialectic of ideas. You know, ideas, I suppose if you wait long enough, maybe it will happen, but praxis is important, particularly if you're going to talk about humanism, especially if God is dead. I mean, the idea of God is that there's no moral background to hold that except ourselves finding a way out. So that, so I want to thank Joseph for mentioning that, but I think I want to unfold some of the micro steps that have been taken to unfold that.
Thank you, Phil. Joseph, then Sharon, then Stephen. Go ahead.
Just really quickly, I just want to come back to this idea of, and I don't want to hijack the discussion too far with the idea of design. I don't want to go too far off basis here, but that the idea of how do you determine what's real and what is true out of a design is really kind of important within that understanding the functions. So then if you're able to determine what is real, what is true, right? If it's true, you would assume then you could determine what is good, correct? And then if you could determine what is good, and it's based on what is the potential in the world that exists. And then how do you bring that potential into reality? And that's understanding the functions. So that's the core of good design, but it also relates to the self. And so that where you're confronting the self with truth. And so that this is actually, it's an interesting idea of how, when you're talking about how to bring things into being that are meaningful, that would be kind of that is the product of the whole idea of form follows function. So and it kind of it manifests itself through language, but it kind of gets to the idea to what Phil was saying, because if you go to a micro level, that's essentially what we're, it's kind of, that's the micro level, is how do you get to truth, and then how do you confront that truth, and how do you determine what's real and what's true, what's false, and then bring things. I don't like to say bring things into being, but essentially, you know what I mean. So anyway, that's the only thing I just wanted to add to that schema, is that, and it's a very difficult thing to unfold. It's constantly unfolding. It's an iterative process as well. So, and it kind of gets to, I don't want to go too far off, but it kind of does get to the Hegelian approach to history too. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, it's you know, my favorite writer on the strengths and weaknesses of the design process is Christopher Alexander. I've mentioned him before. He his book, The Timeless Way of Building, is a classic. But some of his other books are very helpful, like The Oregon Experiment. And in these books, he talks about, among other things, the conflict between the way that we teach people to do design under modernism and the forms of design that actually produced beautiful living places throughout history. And he says one of the big differences is that under modernism, we teach the architect to have a big idea and to impose the big idea on the material. And so that the building is a reflection of the architect, like a big signature. And this is the idea behind, frankly, the Nazi brutalist architecture. I'm going to make a building that looks like a block. I'm going to make a building that looks like a cone. I'm going to make all these things were sort of like I'm signing my noesis upon the world, and it must submit to me. And everyone will look at this building and think, wow, he's so smart. And Christopher Alexander says a lot of bad architecture. I mean, most of the worst architecture comes from that approach. Whereas what Marianne described is what Christopher Alexander is advocating. It's like there is a different approach to, you almost can't call it design because of the way we've polluted the word design, but there's a different approach to the creation of buildings in which the people who are going to use those buildings are deeply involved in the process. And you have to go back and forth, the design has to go back and forth between the people trying to design it and the people who are going to live in it, so that you have, like you said, Joseph, a kind of a dialectic. You give an opportunity for the lived experience of the people to wrestle with the vision of the architect and to try to produce something that's more likely to be good for them. And you can take it as far as Christopher Alexander does, where at some point he says it's even best if people are involved in building their own buildings and if the process of construction never ends, because it just moves to a more stable period where it changes less, but they're still, maybe they add a little extension, or maybe they adjust the steps, or there's this ongoing process of fitting the building to the environment and to the lives of the people as they learn more about what it's like to live in the place. Now that they're there, they can say, oh, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to put the breakfast nook over here. Maybe we could reorganize it a little bit. So this kind of idea of perpetual growth and becoming, in this, he's sort of modeling the Greek concept of physis, from whence, as Sharon pointed out, physiocratic, this idea that we should be ruled by the way that nature is constantly growing and becoming, and try to align our processes with that. But even though when we talk about modernism and abstracto, it seems like that should be allowed under modernism. I mean, after all, aren't we infinitely free under moderns, and don't we believe in democracy, and shouldn't people be able to say what they want? And you sort of, when you look at modernism as an abstraction, it seems like this kind of physiocratic approach to design ought to be fine. But in practice, what we see is that modernism hates it and drives it out. And the reason it drives it out is that modernism isn't about what it teaches us, it's about in abstracto. It's about something else. And that something else, the difference, the delta between the abstract cartoon of modernism in our heads and the actual modernism we live, is so big that it can result in the opposite of good design, because it can be profitable to put as little quality into things as you can and stamp them out as fast as you can and charge as much as you can for them. That process of maximizing profit actually drives out quality, and as part of the way that it streamlines and becomes efficient at generating profit is to eliminate the lengthy, tedious involvement of the people who are going to consume the thing that you're trying to sell them. If you could just get them to shut up and accept whatever you sell them, if you could work with the other producers to drive down the quality to the point that they can't insist that you do something good, because there isn't anything good. Nobody sells anything good. And so their standards lower. And so now they're willing to buy your crap because it's that or somebody else's crap. And what difference does it make? It sounds cynical when I say it out loud, but I have watched this happen in industry after industry that I've been involved with. This is exactly how it works. Because if your economy is a con game, if the whole thing is actually based upon making big promises and then delivering as little as possible, then you have to hollow out quality. You must. Because if you don't hollow out the quality, the guy you're competing with will, and his product, he'll make more money on his product than you will on yours. And so even if yours is better, you'll go out of business and he'll buy you up. So there is this drive to the bottom that comes when the only goal is maximizing the number on the spreadsheet. It's the purification process that happens. Sharon and then Stephen. Go ahead, Sharon.
So we go back to Surfside when you hollow out quality. So we go back to Surfside, the condominium collapse in Miami Beach when you hollow out quality.
Right.
So I just wanted to, and I don't want to harp on this, but Joseph says form follows quality. And the reason I like the word implicates better is because in my discipline, everything has a form, every organ has a form, but the function is multifaceted.
Right.
Right. And so the multifaceted nature of the form is the process. And that's probably the most important word that I heard Joseph say, the process of it. So, and I listened to Marianne in her discussion. She said, in designing a house for the moderns, for the millennials now, they don't want a kitchen anymore because this is a cultural shift. So the kitchen is a community. It's where you sense of community. That's where everybody gathers and eats and chats and explains the day's events. But work, particularly since we're now working at home, has taken center stage. So this is the cultural shift. So this is a new process. So the form of the building is now engaging on a new facet of function. And lastly, I love, Rick, it's extremely instructional for me how you take all our conversation back to the philosophical tenets, because I'm pretty weak at that. So I'm learning every single time you mention it. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sharon. Go ahead, Stephen.
I'm just a little bit disappointed we haven't sort of really stuck with a bit more with the text of what Kenneth Smith was saying. It's huge. I've hardly began reading it, so I'm sort of loosening up. It's making more sense to me now. And this is the big story of history, and the average person just isn't going to have a clue. This sort of stuff's a very, very long slog, a very long journey. But I'll just take us to one point he makes early in the piece, just to bring up the text.
Please. Yeah.
The medieval or Christian worldview arose on contrary premises of a God who was above and apart from nature, and who created the world out of nothing pre-existing. The Greek gods had been immanent in nature, at one with its forces, including its power to sway and intoxicate the psyches of man. So we have two very different worldviews, an apparently more ancient one, where people believed in supernatural forces, but they didn't have such an overwhelming view of the world. This is something which seems to have arisen in the age of the classical Greeks. We have the first empires. We have the first thing approaching world trade. We have the phenomenon of the Phoenicians. Suddenly there's trade going to Britain as a regular enterprise. This is something which prior to that trade had been Jason and the Argonauts. It had been a heroic adventure, but it became regularized. Out of that, we saw the first giant empires. We saw the Assyrian Empire, which got replaced by the Babylonian, which got absorbed by the Persian Empire, which even by today's standards is not being too much larger than that.
Right.
So there was this whole view that the whole world could be under one monarch. This sort of universalism. So there was this element. So Christianity differs from the more ancient religion, and Christianity, he suggests, was contributed much to by the thought of the Greek philosophers.
Yes.
That whole concept that no longer is religion my little thing, off in a little hole in the ground, or I found it in a part of the forest and I found a little God there, a little bit of inspiration in my life, and I have that pure personal freedom of religion and all that. But the idea of an all-powerful God which is above and separate from what he's created.
Yes.
And so this was a revolutionary transition in thought. Now, I'm not saying I'm in particular agreement that this is the way to go or that's the way to go.
Right.
I'm just saying for those ancients, that would have been a shocking experience. If you're just the ordinary pagan who was so into his own little world and, you know, is worshipping some pond or something like that, and then along came Christianity and said, there's this all-powerful God which stands above creation and creates everything. So Kenneth Smith has just pointed to one thing here, and I just thought I'd illustrate that.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I figured this first session about chapter 2 would be sort of an overview introduction because, you know, some people would want to talk about what happened, you know, Friday night, Saturday's discussion, and other people would, you know, would want to do the transitional work. But starting next week, I want to actually go into the text and work our way through it because there's some really meaty stuff here. And what you put your finger on is one of the pivotal sentences, the pairs of sentences in the whole thing, because it is a, you know, I've talked before about the epochs being defined by their different ways of organizing man, God, and nature into a hierarchy of meaning and authority. And it makes it's easy at first glance to take it as a trite intellectualism. You know, you learn it and then you're like, okay, good, I've learned it, and you move on. But these two sentences that you picked out really show the potency of the difference between the ancient worldview and the medieval worldview. The medieval worldview really was a revolution. It really was a direct response to the ancient worldview that was so shocking, as you said, so overwhelming, that in some ways it was noetically intoxicating. You know, to think about a God so great that he's bigger than all other gods put together, because they're all about some specific thing, and he's the God of everything. And he's so godly that he didn't even make the world out of anything in particular, but made it from nothing. The level of omnipotence and omniscience, the infinities, the multiple infinities involved, you know, this, you could see how anybody who had doubts about their own religion would find this pretty powerful, this set of ideas. And you could never mistake a deity of the medieval kind with a deity of the ancient kind. They were worlds apart from each other. Just completely different ways of thinking about the relationship between God and everything else. So it's intriguing. You know, and I love that he opens the section on the medieval epoch with those two sentences, because that really puts it right where it is. You know, another thing he's going to explore about this that's worth keeping in mind as we go forward is this idea that the part of the reason we can't understand the Christian Revolution that was brought in through the medieval epoch is that Christianity in its newly born state, and I don't really mean in the 100s, but I mean when it won, you know, around 500 or whenever we want to put the line, when they became the religion of empire, and they became the one religion that was going to spread over everything, and the evangelical mission of Christianity changed from we'd like more people to know, it became we want everybody to know and to obey and believe. That moment defines the transition into the medieval epoch. And what's hard for us to understand is that they were saying that at a moment in history when all of the context of meaning was ancient. The
Mhm.
physiocratic worldview was shared by all of those people. They may have been medieval Christians with this kind of infinitizing God and this apocalyptic mission to change the world, but they weren't that in isolation. They were that inside the womb of a physiocratic worldview. They understood themselves in response to Rome of the ancients, in response to the physiocratic worldview. And that was, because of their time in history, they could not have conceived themselves abstractly the way we conceive of them. They couldn't have conceived of themselves as Christianity without the physiocratic worldview that they were pushing against. They were as defined by what they were against as they were by what they were for, and they knew both sides of the argument. And our problem, looking back on the medievals, is that we didn't even know there was an argument. Right? When we explain it, we say, well, the Romans were just mean and they were just torturing Christians and nobody would want to be tortured. So, they had to fight back. We don't get that this was a massive pushback against an entire worldview, not just on the basis of, are you torturing me, but on the basis of, I am overthrowing your entire framework of meaning and everything you've ever held sacred. And I know I'm doing it. I know I'm doing something so ballsy, so in your face, right? This is the way they saw themselves. But we don't see them that way anymore, because for us, the medievals are the medievals that Luther was rebelling against at the end of the epoch, with all the corruption and all the frustration and all the disappointment. To us, that's medieval Christianity, right? The thing that had to be turned over. So we really can't see them the way that they saw themselves, let alone see the organic transformation from the revolutionary way they began to the reactionary way that they ended, and why that had to happen the way that it did. But over the course of this book, he's going to try to help us to see that, right? And he's going to try to help us to do the same thing with the ancient order, and then by extension, to do the same thing with our epoch, so that we can begin to see the difference between where it started, where we are now, and then we can start to less arbitrarily imagine where it might be going. So to me, that's part of why this book is so interesting. And, it has its limitations. And I just want to take a moment to underscore a couple of them. And one of them Sharon brought up before, which is, well, what about the Islamic world? Well, the Islamic world was also a medieval world. And there are many things that we can learn about the medieval epoch only really by looking at Islam and not by looking at Christianity. But this book doesn't focus that way. So that's a problem. There are similar things in China. When we look at the near collapse of Confucianism under the pressures of Taoism and Moism, and how it had to reinvent itself as a different kind of religion, as Neo-Confucianism, which then reigned supreme for, 1,000 years, maybe to the present. Mm-hmm. So there was a similar kind of, overthrow and pushback that happened in China, but it had different character, different details, different things to learn about. And of course, none of that's in here, right? And you see the same thing if you study the history of medieval Japan. The rise, medievalism isn't just about Christianity. It is a pattern that has recurred in many places worldwide, and for very good reasons. And as long as we look at medievalism the way this book does within the context of Christian Europe, we're only going to see a little slice of it. We're not going to understand the whole picture. That's one of the weaknesses of the book. But on the other hand, if he did, Kenneth loves to read on multiple subjects. He likes to write on multiple subjects. And if he wrote about all this stuff, the book, he'd still be writing the book. It would have never ended, right? So he had to balance in there.
Rick, how come you talked about China and Japan and not Korea? Korea is right in between Japan and China.
Right, Korea has its own fantastic history. It's true. And Vietnam and the Philippines, we in the West, quote unquote, we are just disgustingly ignorant of some amazing cultures all over the world who have so much to teach us. I'm still coming up to speed myself. So yeah, all honor to Korea, man.
I'm just teasing you.
No, but it's well taken, because the history, especially under modernism, of China and Japan often involves eclipsing Korea, which they totally shouldn't do, because Korea's history goes way back. And Korea has so many fantastic things, like the fact that their writing system is a featural writing system, and there aren't very many of those in the world. It's just amazing.
Wait, Rick, going off on tangent for a bit. I go to this meeting on Sundays, and it's led by Rodrigo. And there's a woman in there who's always one of the co-hosts, and she has a friend
Yeah.
who's in her 90s. And it turns out her grandfather, who formulated a Korean written language, it turns out. She's in her 90s and her grandfather. And I was, wow, something to be descended from the person who created the Korean written language form. Anyway.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah, I this is totally an aside, but there are a number of things about Korea I admire, and I really need to learn more of the history. I love the feature. I care about writing systems and fonts a great deal. I have a lot of friends who are typographers, and the typography sites love the fact that Korean is such an amazingly designed writing system. There just really are almost no systems like it in the world. It's just brilliant.
Yeah, when you really compare Chinese writing versus Japanese writing versus Korean writing, Korean alphabet is much more simplified, and I don't know if you noticed that. Yeah, it's very different. Yeah.
It's an incredible achievement. Another thing that I really love about Korea, since you brought it up, and I'm going to do the aside. Another thing I really love about Korea is the fact that the language is an isolate. The language is an isolate. Nobody knows where it came from. Nobody knows what it's related to. It has roots that go, a lot of other things were like, okay, Chinese is related to this, which is related to that, which is related to that. Japanese has these relationships. English has these relationships. But Korean is like, nobody knows where it came from. It has, wherever its roots come from, they come from some part of history that is invisible to us.
And yet, even when I was a little girl in Korea, going to first 3 or 4 years of grammar school, we had to learn Chinese, written Chinese and oral Chinese, because newspapers were written in Chinese.
Right.
And if you are of the educated class, in order to be able to read the newspapers, so we all had to learn Chinese. So that wasn't, I'm not 90, so it wasn't that long ago that learning Chinese was a requirement in grammar school. So there you go.
Yeah, so, for anybody who doesn't know the significance of Korea being a language isolate, when we're trying to figure out where the Koreans came from, one of the conclusions we have to make is that they're indigenous. And another conclusion that we have to make is that if you look at the coastlines 10,000 BC, before the rise of the waters that came from melting off the glaciers during the Ice Age, you'll find that the entire Korean Sea was above land. It was above water. It was all land. And since people like to live in lowlands and river valleys and coasts, it seems like there is a piece of history sort of outlined by this that means that many of the ancestors of the Koreans would have lived in places that are now underwater. There could be all kinds of ancient ruins under there that show where people were 8,000 BC, 7,000 BC, and so forth, that now are lost to us until underwater archaeology explores there and digs and finds what's there. I don't think we're going to know the roots of the Korean people, because I think we're going to find them out there. If you've never done it before, you should Google Ice Age coastlines. Ice Age coastlines, and look all over the world, because there are places where the coastlines are only a little further out than they are now, but there are places like around Korea where there were massive amounts of land that are now underwater, and that's where people would have lived. So, why does everybody have stories of the flood? Well, the places that people primarily lived 10,000 years ago mostly are underwater now. Anyway, thanks for bringing up Korea. Phil and Donald, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I raised my hand to make a joke of your dislike of sameness.
Please.
Okay, but now the conversation has moved on, and I sort of, but on the same theme, is like, I could understand the security that sameness offers in terms of a spiritual system, because you're secure because it's a transcendental, oneness that controls everything, and that therefore everything is kind of not so much known, but you're secure in that system. So security is an important thing to humanity as well as knowing, okay?
Yeah.
Perhaps more important. But however, when dialectical materialism, when God died, dialectical materialism emerged rather than dialectical idealism, then it's pushed to the kind of the sameness that material is reduced to. The ultimate material is ketchup. I was going to accuse you, why do you hate ketchup? Ketchup give you the security that you go to Bali, or Finland, or anywhere in the world, and don't have to deal with that gross taste of another culture by obliterating it.
Not
as
diversity.
long as you can have ketchup. That gives you security no matter where you go to obliterate that diversity. So I think, but on the other hand, the market of ketchup offers considerable diversity in terms of its labeling and its signs.
Yeah.
And you have plenty of choice, but the same taste. So
right.
why do you hate that sense of security of the instant motel? Anywhere you go, you have the same. I mean, the sameness that allows you to rest assured that you're not going to have to face the shocking nature of something someplace that's different. I mean, I think that's what modern society has provided. That sense of security that even the material difference that nature provides, you could constrain it by the sameness that you could expect in the supermarket.
That's right.
And everywhere in the world.
What if you dislike ketchup? I dislike ketchup intensely.
Well, you're gonna have to learn. You're gonna have to learn the like sameness.
But I appreciate the diversity and the different tastes of food. I would not put ketchup on it. I dislike ketchup, even for French fries.
Looks like we're gonna have to send you to a Chinese re-education camp again.
You're gonna learn to love ketchup. That's all we're gonna offer. Because it's easier to mass produce one sauce than all these bewildering variety of sauces, each of which is supposed to taste different and has different metrics. It's too complicated. We're gonna make one sauce, and everyone's gonna eat it, and you're gonna like it.
Isn't this why people go to Disneyland instead of really dealing with Europe? Like they've been to Epcot.
Yes, MJ.
I went to Disneyland about 10 years ago. I guess no longer than that. Oh God, in 2005, and I hadn't been since I was a little kid, and I had forgotten evidently that they had a whole section that's bringing New Orleans to life inside Disneyland, and there's jazz, there's celebrations of New Orleans culture and food, and the whole time I was thinking, this is so weird that artists have carefully reconstructed sections of New Orleans so that you don't have to go to the real thing. You can come here and have the Disneyland version instead. And I couldn't decide what I was seeing. I mean, I didn't even know quite how to put it into words. The strange experience of they're creating a verisimilitude of the real thing, and they're working hard at it. I mean, every cobblestone, every brick, they worked hard to make it just like the thing that it's totally not.
Well, Las Vegas is even a better example.
Oh yeah,
you could have the Eiffel Tower. You could have the Statue of Liberty. You could have all of it. I think you even have sections of Venice.
Yes.
I mean, and all that is on display at the same time. That it's very, very clear that all they want is your money.
Right.
They make it explicit, and you are happy. You are happy to give them your money because you could see all the famous, icons.
Yes.
the signs
Elvis.
of what things are. So
You can
Las
see all the
Vegas is a
Elvises you
living
want.
example because it's not even isolated, like, you know, it is supposed to be a living city, but in
Yes.
fact, it is all about signs.
Yeah. Yeah, very strange things happen around the issue of safety, diversity versus monoculture, you know, the courage of exploration versus the fear that makes you want to huddle and stay away from the threat of the other. And can we recolonize and repackage the other in a safe form so that you can consume it without being challenged in any way? There's all this stuff going on in here that goes right to the roots of modernism in ways that make us very uncomfortable to think too much about, which is why most of the places that do this are work very hard to make it so that you don't have to worry your pretty head about it at all. You can just go with the flow and enjoy the experience of it. And by enjoy, we mean spend lots of money. That's what enjoyment looks like. You know, keep that money moving. Donald and then Stephen. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, first to Phil, just remind your family that their inheritance depends on your buy-in. You know, you have performed a great virtuous service that they can live pure virtuous lives because they won't have to buy in.
Good job, Donald.
And two, I've never talked with MJ, but I lived in Paris, and periodically we would go to what was then called Euro Disney, because after weeks of, you know, speaking French and dealing like that, our kids would say, let's go get a good cheeseburger and fries. And even though our kids spoke better French than we did, we would get on the train, go over there. Everyone spoke English. We would eat lunch, and largely that would be it. So these things they're like nested dolls. They
are like nested dolls.
You just keep going. And to talk about the text, I know that's a sore subject.
No, it's a good one.
But starting about in ancient, I just want to comment a little bit on the text in
Please.
ancient
Please.
time. In about the third paragraph, I think, he talks about piety, and then fourth, fifth. That's the fifth. Oh yeah, the fifth paragraph.
Yeah.
He brings up courage. That phusis, nature, gives rise to certain virtues. As I remember, and I may be wrong, I'll take that back. I'm not wrong about this. The ancients pointed to 4 primary virtues:
Yes.
piety, courage, justice, and temperance, which in my understanding, piety is what we owe to the past, to the gods, or to phusis, or whatever, wherever we came from, whatever a lot of the given us. Courage has a lot to do with, we need that because, one, our actions have consequences. We can die.
Yeah.
You know, it comes out of this mortality that accompanies all phusis creations. Justice is a virtue because we are in a group. It's a lot about how we treat other people, other things. And temperance is that same virtue directed towards ourselves. So that kind of covers the complete directional landscape.
Right.
And while he doesn't mention all 4, the way he gets to piety and courage, the need for them, directly because we are a creature within
nature,
yes,
is quite nicely done here. And he probably stole it all from Aristotle or somebody, but
Nicomachean Ethics, yeah,
you
came
know,
right out of there.
but anyway, it's that, yes. And this is where Kenneth differs a lot from other existential. There is a human nature, and many existentialists say there isn't.
Right.
You know, because if you thought there was a human nature, then you would be an essentialist,
Right.
not an existentialist.
Mm.
But he's an essentialist existentialist.
Yeah, he's
My God.
maybe he's essentially
I don't know.
existentialist. Yes, you know,
That's right.
but that is good. But we do have to discover that nature in history,
Right.
and through study. It's not like Descartes. Well, I'll lay in bed one day and rummage around in my head and discover what human nature is.
Right. And get it wrong.
Yeah, and get it wrong. Right. So I kind of like that. And there are a few quibbles, though.
Yeah, please.
He says that modern order is an artificial stasis, a becalmed universe frozen or fossilized. Well, anyway, a stasis is now stasis is he's italicized it, so I think it's kind of Greek.
Yes.
But stasis has sort of a double meaning in Greek.
Yes.
In that it's primarily, I think its primary thing is civil war.
Yes.
Which is stasis. But stasis comes about because people within a polis take a stand, which is stasis.
Right.
And during the war, the polis fails to progress. It becomes becalmed,
Stuck.
and it's stuck.
Yeah.
So I just read that and I said, he's overloaded that term. He's got, or he's dealing with all the meanings.
Yes.
Of that. I went back to my Little and Scott, and I was trying to figure out what is that, because when I see stasis, almost invariably it's war.
Yes.
It's civil war. And,
well, because it's a contronym, right? It's the Greeks did it. It's a contronym. They made it have opposite meanings, just like English does all the time.
And then strangely, he uses, to me, not strangely, he uses the word cosmos, but doesn't, in this case, as he does in other places, go into that.
Yes.
The orderliness that the word cosmos in Greek,
right.
Of course he did an ideological here, is not chaos but order.
Right.
In fact, it describes how they arrange their phalanxes and stuff. They get the citizens out, they order them up, they cosmetize them, they order things.
Right.
And so this is and I put a note in the chat about, I don't know what this is on autarkia. Because that's in the first paragraph in Ancient, where I find two Greek words, both autarkia with a CH, that's the chi, and autarkia with a K. And one with the CH means self-rule.
Yes.
And with the K means self-sufficiency. Now they would sound very much alike. And I don't know if this is Kenneth's ear stuff. I don't know. Kenneth.
I can tell you, I know what he's doing.
Kenneth picks up a lot of Greek, but as far as I know, I don't think he ever studied Greek. And
well, he worked on a translation of a Greek work in college.
Oh, did he?
He said in college he had a reputation for being a Greek translator, which he says he totally doesn't deserve, because he had to work with Liddell and Scott and all the other references and laboriously work his way through. But he does selectively pick a certain amount of Greek vocabulary and grammar that he really works with. And I know what's happening in the case of these words you're picking out.
Okay.
So you're raising a very good question. I probably wouldn't have thought to talk about if you hadn't raised it.
I would say
Second one.
I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Plato's Laches.
Yes.
And as part of the rules are, you cannot comment on a translation.
Right.
And so I was forced to read it in Greek.
Yes.
And, and then they had some classics professor there that randomly pointed to sentences in the Greek text and says, oh, what does this say? Don't ask me to do that again. It would not work today. It barely worked 50 years ago.
Yes.
But so I can believe that he had to, as a student, translate the document.
Yes.
And I don't, so.
I wrote down somewhere what it was that he was working on, but the professor he was doing it for ended up dying before they could finish. So it never got published.
Yeah, I had a professor that had me working on going through and finding all the people names and place names and stuff in Plato, and then looking them up in some 19th century encyclopedias put together by all these German linguists, not Nietzsche, but whatever. And then they wrote in German and they quoted the original Greek, and then I would translate all that and put it on 5x7 cards. And then at the beginning of every dialogue, I would say, here's information about them. So I think, Kenneth, that's pretty common now that I hear that story about how it would arise.
Where's the second or different meaning of that word autarkia? What paragraph is it in?
He only uses, he uses autarkia. It's in the first paragraph.
Yes.
Yeah, that I see.
Self-rule.
He doesn't say the other one.
He doesn't.
What Donald's alluding to is that he's actually making a pun in Greek. And the reason he's doing that is because the key to understanding Kenneth Smith is that in the same way that his professor Paul Weiss was a master of Hegel and saw everything through Hegelian lenses, in the same way Kenneth Smith is a master of Heraclitus and sees everything through Heraclitean lenses. His take on Hegel, his take on Nietzsche, his take on Kierkegaard, Hannah Arendt, anything, you name it, he's bringing Heraclitean perspective. And Heraclitus was a master of concentration, of saying as much as possible in the fewest possible words. Ethos, anthropoi, daimon. And from that, you have an entire description of how free will and determinism work in human beings. He said it in 3 words. And that kind of level of concentration that Heraclitus pulled off is something that Kenneth Smith, despite the fact that he writes at great length, what he really longs to do is to make these pregnant, pithy, potent little bits of philosophical poetry. That's what he wants more than anything. And so, like Heraclitus, he uses the trick of using rhymes and contronyms and paradoxes to say more than one thing at the same time. So when Heraclitus says ethos anthropoi daimon, he's not just saying one person's character is their fate. He's also saying any group of people's character together collectively is their fate. And history, ages of history, their character as an age of history is the fate of that age of history. Their character drives it. And so he's simultaneously saying things at multiple scales using only 3 words. And he does that throughout. If you look at the Greek, which is really interesting to do with Heraclitus, you find an inordinate number of puns and ambiguities and cases where you're not sure which word is the subject and which one is the object. And that's because he means it both ways at the same time. And so Kenneth Smith likes to find opportunities to do that. And English doesn't support it as well as Greek does. But he does it when he can. And he certainly does it when he pulls out his Greek. So autarkia, self-rule, and self-sufficiency I know Kenneth means the pun, that the autarkia with the CH and the autarkia with the K. He means that even though in Greek they're two different words, they sound to us like the same word when it's spoken, and that's useful because if you're not self-sufficient, how can you rule yourself? Whatever it is that is not sufficient is going to be something that has a handle on you. And in this, he's alluding to Heraclitus saying it would not be better for men if they got what they wanted, because our desires are used as a leash upon us. So he means the pun. I know he means the pun here. And with cosmos, Donald, you're right. He definitely means the lawfulness, the organization that's possible because of the lawful nature of the thing as an organism, not just, he means definitely not the English word universe, which is just a place that happens to have everything in it.
Right.
He means that it created itself. It is a realm of becoming and transformation that unfolded itself over time according to its lawful nature, and that lawful nature is what makes its organization and its life possible. He means all of that by the word cosmos. He's trying to pull all of that in.
And yeah, that's good. I'm glad you did that. And of course, to get back to Goodwin's law,
yeah,
one of the persons in 20th century that was really concerned with autarkia was Hitler.
Yeah, God help us.
You know, that he wanted a greater Germany that was self-sufficient and independent. It's something like, well, anyway, and then there's the best one. I'll save the best one for last here.
Yes.
He talks about, when he talks about, I don't know Latin. I don't know Latin. Fluctuate, flourished.
Yes.
He talks about in Greek the acme, which we all know because that's where
Roadrunner
got his anvils, was from the Acme Anvil Company.
Right. What
happened to Acme never got anything. It was a coyote.
Yes, Coyote. Coyote. God help us.
Coyote got all his anvils from Acme Anvil.
Yes.
So
yes.
The pinnacle of anvil companies.
Yes. You know, it's a good choice because there's another hidden joke here, which is that Kenneth Smith talks a lot about the way that under modernism, where we have no culture, we only have this anti-culture, we have a resentment towards people who are conspicuous examples of culture of the past. And one of the ways that resentment comes out is by saying, history's stupid and not studying it. But another way we do it is by naming our dogs after who previously were considered to be the most amazing people in history that people wanted to be like. So we name our dogs Aristotle, right? Or even Rex is an act of resentment. You're saying, kings, I don't need any kings. I got this dog here and he does what I say. So who's the boss? Haha, I win, right? So he talks about the way the culture of resentment turns into that. And so there is a way in which us taking the concept of the acme, which is very nearly a sacred concept from Greek culture, and turning it into Wile E. Coyote's source for every stupid harebrained idea and failed scheme. It's just painful.
I have a similar feeling. One of the landscapers for one of my neighbors has on the side of their trunk a truck, some landscaping company, and then it says Reyes and Sons. And I keep looking at that and say, that should be Reyes and Princes. The sons of the king are princes.
Right.
Does this, why is this? Well, we have kings of sandwiches and everything else out here, the Reyes de la Torta. But anyway, enough.
Yeah, the way he talks about modernism as having no coherency of its own when it comes to the subjective life or the experiential life or values and principles, and that we have to import them from past cultures, and that they come in as chopped up bits trailing all of the sinews and connections to the things they've been cut away from, so that now they don't really make sense because they're not part of an organic whole. They're like a Frankensteinian assemblage of things that really were never meant to go together, but we've sewn them together and said, okay, well, this will be our values and such. Whenever someone asks us what our values are, instead of saying, I don't know what a value is, we'll say, well, whatever, this Christian thing, or this Greek thing, whatever. You can see the way in which all of these incredibly important terms from the ancient world and medieval world, we use them all over the place for whatever we like, whether it makes any sense or not. On your desktop is an icon. An icon used to be a sacred thing. And now it's just whatever little picture you double click on to go look at your porn or whatever the hell you're doing on your computer, right? I mean, it's like there's this way in which we have completely destroyed the difference between the sacred and the profane in modernism, because we can't coherently explain any such difference. So for us, why not name your dog Jesus? To a past era, that would be a blasphemy, and to our era, it's like no worse than anything else we do every day when we're constantly mixing up the things that should matter with the things that don't matter. I'm going to call on Stephen in a second, but I put in the chat a link. The Internet Archive has published Philip Wheelwright's book Heraclitus as a free PDF. If you click on that, you can get the PDF and have the complete text of mine and Kenneth Smith's favorite translation and the commentary on Heraclitus. So that will give you a lot of insight into reading Kenneth Smith, and it's yours for free. So
saved it. I saved it already. I will read it.
God bless the Internet Archive. That is one truly great program. And now, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just going to refer to something a few years ago. On the night the glorious Trump came to power, I didn't even know about it. I went and met with a few friends at a restaurant who were all blaring socialists, of course, which I have gone past. I've seen the error of my ways in socialism. I spent almost a lifetime being a socialist, and I discovered the error. And anyway, I was sitting down with these people, and one lady I've known for a long time, the son was there, and he was a teacher and quite a bright guy. He's tried to bring student of philosophy and trying to bring philosophy into the classroom and all that. And I was sitting down, now the revolution's going to start. I think the thing that we really need to do is to reduce education. There's too much of it. And I think if we took it back, rather than to a standard of 12 years, we brought back the basic education to a standard of 8 years, so we could fill up people's lives with less junk. He looks at me with horror and he says to me, how could more education be a bad thing? And okay, you can shoot me down in flames. My whole point is I take that phrase, how can more education be a bad thing? Like, today is everything which is refined, which was historically known for only being good when it was quality. Now the good is purely quantity. If we have masses of this, it must be good. If we have masses of that, it must be good. Masses of everything, it must be good. And the modern socialist is waiting there, with his plate out, thinking that the world should just be his conveyor belt. Come along, give me some dinner. This is a modern socialist. And more of it. I'll eat myself until I'm sick. But I just found that a guy who was quite bright would say something like that how can more education be a bad thing? Is good purely defined by quantity? More is always better.
False equivalency.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, the question that has to be raised under any educational system is not so much the quantity, but what are you teaching? What are you teaching them to be able to do? Or if you teach 45 years, you provide 45 years of free education, but you never once teach people how to think critically for themselves, what have you done them a favor? Or have you just stuffed them full of facts that will make them useful in the marketplace? There's a level at which the critical thing about education, and certainly the Greeks would say so, is there are certain things that people need to understand in order to be able to come into the full maturity of their powers as human beings. And those things are essential to teach, but also those are the things we don't actually teach. We mostly teach people how to get along well and fit in and be productive. So yeah, there are some important questions here that just don't get explored. And it's funny when we're talking about cultures we don't like, we have no problem hearing the sneer in phrases like education camps. Oh, well, clearly he needs to be sent to an education camp. We can get the idea that there's a problem. But when we're talking about ourselves, our glorious, wonderful selves, of course, that's inconceivable. And so the only thing that about an education is it can only be the good form. It couldn't possibly be the bad form. So yeah, it's a fraught subject. So we're at the end of our time. I really enjoyed talking with everybody today. I think maybe next week we go into the text itself and we'll work our way through it. I'm gonna put together a lot of notes. You guys do the same, and we'll see what all's in here. But as the attempt to do an overview for the entire, I see that. As an attempt to do the overview for the entire book, here is one of the places where he is doing that characteristic thing that he does in his philosophy style, where he is continually referencing other philosophers and their ideas in order to bring the whole picture together without him having to say everything. So we'll unpack some of that next week.
I'll try to read the right text.
Sure. That'll be helpful. I mean, it's not that Dramas of the Mind isn't fun. It's just not actually the book work.
Well, thank you as always, Rick. Really enjoy listening to you all.
Yes, thank you very much, Rick.
Especially Professor
good,
Marshall.
Actually. This was very good, actually.
And thank Korea for K-dramas.
Okay. It's good to see you, Marianne. Good to see you, Joseph.
Nice to see you, Jenny. Nice to see everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Nice to be
Bye.
back. Take care.
Bye.